everyone to the 5th Annual Mars Conference. My name is Louis Michael Reinhardt. I am the host and organizer of the conferences. We have a great lineup today. We're going to have Andrew D. Basiago. He's going to be our keynote speaker, and he's going to be talking about Destination Mars.
Hi, welcome everybody. This is Andrew D. Basiago. I'm the president and founder of the Mars Anomaly Research Society. This is our 5th annual conference. The Mars Anomaly Research Society, I founded in 2009 with my friend and colleague Judge Alfred Langley as a direct result of my publication of a paper called The Discovery of Life on Mars in December of 2008. Alfred and I then founded the Mars Anomaly Research Society in January 2009. You know, sometimes things emerge by emergency. In fact, the group was founded because the skepticism about the notion of extraterrestrial life in our solar system was so thorough going in exopolitics that none of the major exopolitical organizations would agree to publish my paper, even though it has stood the test of time over the last 7 years as what I was claiming at the time that my paper was. It's the first paper to prove that Mars is an inhabited planet, and in a broader sense, it's the first paper to show photographs of humanoid and other life forms of details that show ancient artifacts, biological beings, statues, and structures in the West Valley of the Gusev crater of Mars. That's the image where there was that famous statue on the edge of a cliff showing what looks like a woman in a blue dress. And so the paper was initially published at exopolitics.com by Alfred Weber, and then we decided to found the organization after the National Geographic declined to even consult with me about what I had found, much less have me work with a writer to prepare my paper as a shorter article in the National Geographic, which is a journal I've been reading since I could read as a first grader. And what's ironic now is that now that Elon Musk is producing a show with National Geographic, they've misappropriated the name of our organization, capital M, capital A, capital R, capital S, to have Elon Musk speculate as to what we might find when we finally reach Mars. Well, as you're going to learn today, long before I wrote my paper, Discovery of Life on Mars, I was part of a group of American astronauts in the secret space program who were reaching Mars. In fact, American astronauts have been on Mars since no later than 1964. So at the very time that NASA began heralding the Mariner program and images that suggested that there might be life, animal or human, on the surface of Mars, the United States was already going there. And when I went there between 1981 and 84, we also encountered Soviet, Russian, and British teams of jumpers. And so my presentation today is going to be about the Mars jumpering program. This presentation rather does exist on the internet, and some of you may have seen on YouTube. But I've done a lot to improve it and tie up some of the details. Because I have been medically grounded by my physician as a result of some fluid retention on my lungs, because I recently went on a 2-month speaking and fundraising tour, basically sick. I should not have gone. I'm going to just take my time and relax today and try to pull out the details, just because I have to kind of speak rather slowly and cautiously and not overexert myself until we figure out exactly what's going on with my health. So what I'll do now is I'll connect to the PowerPoint, and I'll start today's presentation. Okay, today's presentation is called Destination Mars. It's a production of my organization, Project Pegasus, of which I'm also the founder and leader. Destination Mars is the outgrowth of one truth campaign that I've been waging since 2004, when I first spoke about my time travel experiences in DARPA's Project Pegasus. It evolved over time into a truth campaign with two goals. The first goal, represented by my Pegasus icon on the left, is to give a true account of my experiences in Project Pegasus so that humanity can be informed about the fact that time travel was achieved by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, in 1970, and that in particular, the teleportation technology that Project Pegasus developed should be declassified and deployed to assist humanity in being involved in real-time transport, not time travel, but real-time transport that is faster, more efficient, safer, and less expensive and less environmentally destructive than any transport that we currently know. Imagine traveling between London, England, and Sydney, Australia, not in 24 hours via commercial passenger plane, but in several seconds via teleport. Such a world has been not possible, but feasible, doable, since 1970. The second major prong of my truth campaign has been, as symbolized by our Mars logo on the right, featuring one of the plesiosaur-like creatures on Mars as seen in NASA's recent images, and there are many of these on Mars, they're a commonplace life form there, is to give a true account of the life forms on Mars, and the hidden history of human visitation of Mars, so that humanity knows what it also has a right to know as part of its common heritage, and that is that we live not just in an inhabited universe, but we live indeed in an inhabited solar system. The planet that every 2 years comes closest to us in its irregular orbit around the sun, the planet Mars, is in fact inhabited in ways similar to the way that Earth is inhabited, and with major similarity in the life forms, but also divergence between the respective life forms. Okay, so a major part of today's talk is about the CIA's Mars Jump Room program, which I was first trained in 1980, and I left in 1984. But let's first go back to my experiences in DARPA's Project Pegasus that took place between 1968 and 72, when I was aged 6 to 11, because that's why I was selected, I believe. Okay, I served in DARPA's Project Pegasus, I first teleported between New Jersey and New Mexico about a year after this, which is my kindergarten picture, was taken. So I was just really a little guy when my late father brought me into the program, in which I would ultimately be involved in 8 different modalities of time travel, which we will not cover today. Okay, now, when I was on Project Pegasus, my father was occasionally interacting with the defense attaché connected to the project. And the defense attaché is the man who was interacting between project engineers like my father and the Department of Defense. And that individual was somebody who would go on to twice be Defense Secretary of the United States under Presidents Ford and George W. Bush. And that individual was Donald Henry Rumsfeld. When we were working with Rummy, as he was known back in the day, he had just served as a naval aviator in the Korean War, and then for many years as a congressman from the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. He was not yet 40 years of age. This is a later picture of Rumsfeld. At a particular meeting at a bar in Albuquerque, Mr. Rumsfeld explained to my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, that the plan that the Defense Department had is that when the children in Project Pegasus reached high school age, they would be admitted to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, and that would be used as an operational cover, basically, for involving us in later project activity. So just as the Philadelphia experiment literature suggests, the Navy does have ambit for time travel because initially the Navy was responsible for knowing and guarding the United States from threats that were over the physical horizon. But then when time travel emerged, the Navy then became responsible for being involved in detecting what was over the quantum horizon that might reach us in a non-linear way from other areas of time-space. So it was their plan to send us onto the Navy so that we would be the first cadre of adult U.S. chrononauts, or time travelers, trained from early childhood. There's the Annapolis logo on the right, or crest, if you will. Coat of arms, I guess. Now, when I was a high school student, I was about 16 years old, I must have been a junior in high school. My father sat me down at our home in Southern California and explained that I was going to be going to the Naval Academy after high school, and that I had to arrange an interview with my local congressman, who was this gentleman, Barry Goldwater, Jr., the son of Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who was a member of the House of Representatives. When you're admitted to a military academy, you have to have an interview by your congressman in the district, congressional district that you live in. Barry Goldwater Jr. had offices over in Woodland Hills, California, a suburb of Los Angeles. We were living in Chatsworth, also a suburb of Los Angeles, in Barry Goldwater Jr.'s district. And this meeting was scheduled, and I stood it up. And in fact, Alfred Weber says this is really where your truth campaign began, when you exercised your own free will and you resisted your father's instruction to apply to the Naval Academy. And you even sort of insulted the congressman who was going to do the interview by just not going to the interview. I didn't even call his office. And I remember I received about a 10-minute phone call from his secretary where she upbraided me for not calling the office. And did I realize that Mr. Goldwater was a member of the United States House of Representatives and his time was precious? And they were really quite angry at me. Now, hold on. Later, when I was at UCLA, I would be brought into the CIA's Mars Jump Room program anyway. So the U.S. government, in a sense, did get its pound of flesh for the investment it made in me as a child time traveler by ultimately involving me in the Mars Jump Room program, which, by the way, involved some Annapolis students, or cadets, if you will, who would have been my peers and contemporaries in Annapolis had I not basically skipped out on the Navy and not gone to Annapolis. So I guess my point here is, the reason I included this as some of the background to my jump room experience is, I was supposed to be at the Naval Academy, but they ended up involving me and some people who did enroll at the Naval Academy in the Mars Jump Room program anyway. So there you have it. The kind of suspension of people's liberty that can result when you have a government as powerful as the United States government. So I ended up serving in the secret space program, as I probably would have if I had gone to the Naval Academy. Now, in childhood, here in part 4, 5 foreshadowings. In childhood, there were 5 foreshadowings when I was serving on Project Pegasus that suggested my later involvement in the Mars Jump Room program. The first occurred in 1968, right around the time when I first teleported to New Mexico with my late father. I know that jump took place between September of 1967 and September of 1968, because when we met with Dr. Harold M. Agnew, the Manhattan Project physicist, when he was the director of the W division, the weapons division at the labs, I went along with my dad on that teleporting and that meeting. And Dr. Agnew looked over at me and said, "How old?" And my father and I said simultaneously, 6. So right around the time there when I first teleported, at least the first teleporting that I can remember, I may have jumped with my dad to New Mexico as early as age 4, because I have very sort of infantile memories of interacting with his friend Connie Chavez at her house in Albuquerque. But I know it couldn't have been later than my first grade year, which was 1967-68. Around this time, my dad came back from his employer, the Ralph M. Parsons Company, one of the world's largest and most defense-involved engineering companies in the world, which then had offices on Wall Street in New York City. In fact, I remember being in Ralph M. Parsons' office one time when they were still in New York on Wall Street and interacting with Mr. Parsons. And my dad came home from Parsons to our home in Mars Plains, New Jersey one night. He was not drunk, but he had a few drinks, so he was a little inebriated. And he gathered my mother and 4 siblings and I in our living room and said, listen to what this person has written. It's extremely funny. The premise is that this person is describing the first life forms to be detected on Mars. And I now realize, having written my paper in 2008, that what my dad was reading were very short passages from my 41-page paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, that were the most fanciful or even farcical passages. If you read that paper, if you haven't already, I would recommend it, but if you read that paper, you'll see I was doing things like giving fun names to some of the life forms, because I wanted school children to connect to the paper and be able to read and enjoy it and start imagining what it would be like to explore further in the cosmos and encounter these animals as I encountered them when I was during my college years on Mars. So I intentionally embedded in the paper a kind of a whimsical Lewis Carroll kind of undercurrent with, for example, the naming of the creatures. When my dad was basically laughing his head off reading this 2 or 3 page document, which I now realize were summaries that somebody at CIA must have done to misinform my dad about my later paper, something kind of primal was triggered in my mind. And I did something I haven't done before or since, which is I ran across the living room, snatched the file folder out of my dad's hand that he was reading from, and ran up to the 2nd level of the house, up the stairs, with my dad chasing me. And I opened the folder and I read the caption of the document that he was reading from. At the top of the document, it said CIA memorandum. Then there was an actual functional caption that said, Andrew Basiago, The Discovery of Life on Mars, 2008, excerpts. So somebody had gone through my paper, which had been sourced from 2008 when it was published or later, and taken back in time to this 1968 timeframe, 40 years earlier, or earlier. And my dad was being actively misinformed by CIA because somebody had clearly bowdlerized my paper to kind of make silliness out of it and distort it. And so that led to this episode at the house where my dad was having a good laugh at what he was reading. The next year, 1969, in the summer, my dad was giving me a haircut up in the bedroom level of the house. And of course, in that era, I was getting haircuts like the one that you just saw, almost crew cuts. That's probably the longest that my hair got at that time. So my dad's giving me a crew cut in the summer. I was giving me a crew cut or a flat top in the summer. And he put his razor down and he said, hold on just a second. And he went over to his briefcase and he pulled out a manila envelope that had a red wax seal, that had a tie string around it, that he had already broken inside this envelope. And he pulled out what in those days we called a mimeograph, which was an early photocopy. And he said, take a look at this, son. And I said, what is it, Dad? And he said, it's a Martian. And I said, really? How could it be a Martian? And he said, it's a humanoid on Mars. And I said, yeah, but how did they photograph it? And he said, well, in the future, NASA sends rovers up to the surface of Mars, and one of them was riding along the surface and took this picture. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. And then he said, guess who finds it? And I said, who? And he says, you do. And I said, I do? And he goes, yeah, in the future, you're going to write a paper in which you show your findings about the life forms that are in NASA's photographs. So this was at a time before he knew I would be going there in the 1980s. This is still around the time that I'm being brought into Pegasus. He's been on Pegasus for several years. And I think at this point he had only been briefed on the fact that we would reach Mars via land rover and take pictures like this. This is what we call the humanoid being on Tsiolkovsky Ridge. I don't know with what resolution it's showing up on your screen there, but it's basically one of the Homo martis martis, the indigenous Martians who are kind of elfin and have spindly bodies, who has his back to us, and he's leaning over a rock ledge or wall, and he's wearing a pair of pants that are cinched up at the waist with a kind of a thick belt, and he's kind of kneeling in soil there, and either playing with or lifting a child. There are some smaller Martians beyond the rock ledge. So my dad was basically briefing me on the fact that my destiny included some contributions to Marsology, including publishing some of the first details in NASA's images that show that Mars is inhabited. Now, I'm using these pictures of Jackie Coogan on the left as Uncle Fester on the Addams Family TV show, and actor Mike Myers as Dr. Evil in the Austin Power films over on the right, to indicate an encounter I had in summer of 1970 with several Martians over at an air base in central New Jersey. It may have been Curtiss Wright, it may have been McGuire Air Force Base, Fort Dix. I don't know exactly where it was, but it did have an airfield. My dad said, "Come on, Andy, let's take the car over to Curtiss Wright." So we got in the car and we closed the doors, because my dad and I, it was our secret that we were teleporting and doing other forms of time travel. I said, "Are we going to be going to New Mexico?" And he said, "No, there are some Martians over there and they want to meet you." So the whole 15 minutes between Mars Plains and Woodridge, New Jersey, where Curtiss Wright was, or another local air base that was about 15 minutes away, I couldn't really fathom what my dad was talking about meeting Martians. And he kind of got impatient with me, and he actually stopped the car over the shoulder of the road and said, "Son, they're human beings just like us, except they live on Mars." So we went over there, and we went into a big hangar. There was kind of a landing dock over on the right, and beyond this stage-like landing dock, there was a silver reverse teardrop-shaped, tiny little conventional spacecraft. It was not a flying saucer. It was like an Aurora space plane that was tapered in the back, so that generally it had this pulsing quality, with the front being kind of like a tear and then the back kind of being tapered. It was maybe about the size of a compact car, maybe like an MG Midget or something. I mean, a very small compact car. My dad took me over to the left side, where we went into one of the briefing rooms that were very much like the NASA briefing rooms, where you've got a card table, folding chairs, and coffee being drunk from styrofoam cups. There was another aerospace engineer there from the Earth, or the United States, including my dad, and then there were 3 Martian astronauts who were bald, homely, male humanoids. These would be the Homo Martis Terris, who are the descendants of the Earthlings that went to Mars and basically got trapped there and ended up procreating for the last 11,500 years since the solar system catastrophe. Around 9500 BC, as depicted or described by Graham Hancock in his really phenomenal study of this subject called The Mars Mystery, both Earth and Mars were hit by debris from space. Some scholars have suggested it was the Vela supernova explosion. We really don't know what caused this material to strike Mars. When it did strike Mars, it destroyed the Martian biosphere. It knocked the Martian ionosphere off of its atmosphere. It created a massive flood that left, as Richard C. Hoagland has described Mars, a vast muddy wasteland, basically a desert planet with scarce vegetation. And it caused the Martian humanoids to go underground, both the ones that are the descendants of our ancestors who went to Mars in prehistory, or not really in prehistory, in the history of the first civilization on Mars, on Earth. That was the civilization that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx, the Great Platform at Baalbek, Lebanon. And that's something none of us has grown up knowing, that we are in fact living in the second civilization to thrive on Earth. After the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, there was about 6,500 years of low developmental levels on Earth. So for example, Otzi, the Italian Iceman, body that they found in the Italian Alps, he dates from about 5,500 years ago. He had 40 tools on him, even though he was ostensibly a caveman. Okay, so there was a survivor civilization that stemmed from that great civilization that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx and was on Mars and existed for we don't know how many tens of thousands of years before it was destroyed by that solar system catastrophe. As a result of that catastrophe, Mars was squished into an oblate planet. It was fractured, and life persisted there, but as a survival civilization, both human and animal. Not a climax civilization, but really a post-disaster civilization where, for example, on Mars, we find a lot of rapacious predation between carnivores as a major form of nutrient cycling in the food chain and ecosystem. Mars has very scant and delicate vegetation. It's uncommon when you're on the surface to encounter a humanoid or an animal, but you do. Some of them are quite vicious because of the tenacity they had to possess to survive the die-off that occurred after the catastrophe. So for those who want to go to Mars under the aegis of Elon Musk and others, I can say I've been there and it's not a place I want to go back to. But in any case, this was my third foreshadowing that I would one day go to Mars, because when we met with these Martian astronauts, when I was over in the briefing room, one of them said, "Oh, he's quite a handsome lad." And another said to my father, "Ray, I can see why he writes the paper and is interested in our planet." So apparently what happened is when these Martian astronauts were in liaison with our aerospace engineers like my dad, there must have been some discussion that Ray's son, Andy, would write an important paper about Mars in the future. And then when that was told to the Martian astronauts, they asked to meet me. They then got up and walked past my father and I, out of the briefing room, and down a staircase and along the floor where their little spacecraft was hovering, going put, 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 put. And the last of the three of them turned to my father and said in perfect, unaccented English, "Ray, it was a pleasure visiting your beautiful planet again, and a privilege to meet again with you. Thank you for introducing us to your son, Andrew. I hope we can meet next time we come to Earth." So they were very much humans like us that were living on Mars, and of course are our genetic relatives. Now they've been breeding in a very restricted gene pool for 11,500 years. When I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, I received a telephone call from a woman who had been one of my facilitators when I was on Project Pegasus as a child. A woman named Virginia Olds, or Ginny Old, who is from the Olds family of Eli Ransom Olds, of Oldsmobile fame. And Virginia said, "You did a bang-up job on your paper. It's all accurate, and there's about 1 million Martians of several typologies living primarily underground." So they're breeding. It's to the extent that 1 million humanoids includes the indigenous original form of Martian that they probably can't breed with. These types of Martians are procreating in an even smaller gene pool or breeding population than 1 million individuals. It's probably maybe 500,000 individuals. So it's produced a kind of a rugged handsomeness in the males. I have had no contact with the females of this typology. I would say that at their best, these Martians are maybe as handsome as, let's say, somebody who kind of looks like this, like a Patrick Stewart, the actor, but often they're quite homely because of close breeding. You know, when we increase genetic diversity by breeding across existing ethnic lines, we enrich the human race, not diminish it. Okay, so they are stuck in a smaller gene pool, a much smaller gene pool. We have a gene pool of about 7 billion individuals, and they have less than 1 million. So it's producing some occurrence of recessive traits in the individuals. Now, in 1971, in November, I had gone out with bronchitis trick-or-treating at the end of October, and my bronchitis worsened. I still have lung problems as a result of that bronchitis. Nonetheless, when I was recuperating at our home in Morris Plains, my dad came into my sick room and said, "Andy, I want to show you something." And he opened up another manila envelope with a red wax seal and he took out an academic paper and said, take a look at this. And I said, what is it, Dad? He says, it's a paper about life forms on Mars that you write in the future. And he said, take a look at the copyright designation at the bottom of page 1. What year does it say? And I read copyright 2008, Andrew Basiago, all rights reserved. In November of '71, I was all of 10 years old. And he said, right, you're going to be 47 years old when you publish the discovery of life on Mars. He said, son, the purpose of this exercise is for you to read and understand everything in this paper. I want you to read the text, study the photographs, read the captions and relate the caption material to the photographs, and I'll go away for a couple hours so you can read the paper twice. But when I come back, we can talk about it. And I said, Dad, what's the point if I'm going to be writing this anyway? And he's in the future. He said, because when you do write it, we want it to contain as much data about life forms on Mars as possible. So they were apparently involving me in some kind of what I call a quantum enrichment, where by sharing future data with me, they must have believed that they could improve the data in the paper as it would later be written in 37 years into the future. I now realize that because time travel was new and experimental, they really hadn't thought that out very well, because after all, when I studied NASA image PIA 1014 for about 1,000 hours in 2008, beginning in January of 2008, when we first started to see the scenes of the little lady on the cliffs in edge, what I call the beings on the edge. She's been called everything. She's even been called Little Bigfoot, which is ridiculous. But I had been studying that paper, that photograph rather, to write a paper about it intently, and been finding all manner of life forms and artifacts. And since I needed to do that research into the photograph in real time, how could reading the result of my research, my paper, somehow be improved by reading it before I wrote it? But nonetheless, that's what they were involving me in. And so the discovery of life on Mars is like, for example, Alfred Weber's book Exopolitics, a quantum artifact, because I encountered it before I wrote it, just as I encountered Alfred's book Exopolitics before I edited it for my friend Alfred Weber. So that's part of the background of my Mars experience, is that being the fact that this paper was prioritized by the CIA and taken back from a time after its publication back to the time of my childhood, apparently so that the CIA could study it. But then a decision was made to brief me on the contents of my later paper. So I don't think it was very effective. It certainly was the pretext to brainwash me about the content and kind of control what I would later write, because my writing of the paper was based on analysis in real time of the photograph and its original text. Now, that originality may have been influenced unconsciously by some of my own content that I read in childhood, but I wrote the paper, and I'm not gonna, I'm never gonna acknowledge that it was from some other cause. It was a difficult paper to write. It involved hours and hours and hours of scrutiny of the photograph, and hours of writing the paper. The paper took me 3.5 weeks to write in November, December of 2008, and oddly, I was playing Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet over and over and over again, just to remain focused on what I was writing. I was basically listening to Paul Desmond's alto saxophone solo in that piece on YouTube, having been an alto saxophone player myself in childhood. And I've always listened to a lot of sax music when I'm writing, and I got myself basically into a kind of a creative fugue state or trance, and wrote the paper. And it was a difficult one to write, because I was trying to be as true to what I was finding in the photograph, not remembering from the past, as possible. Okay, now the fifth of these 5 foreshadowings occurred when I was actively in New Mexico on Project Pegasus. Connie Chavez, my dad's former girlfriend and longtime friend in Albuquerque, was babysitting me at the restaurant in Old Town, where she was for many years a waitress and cashier. In fact, Connie Chavez was kind of like the Lola Montez of Albuquerque. She was a folklorically significant individual. And my dad then came back to probably the La Hacienda restaurant. It could have been La Placita, and from a meeting, and he looked like he'd punched in the stomach. He really looked bad. He looked almost jaundiced. And he said, Connie, let's take this discussion over here. I don't want Andy to hear this. And they started talking away, and then I gradually wandered across the restaurant, zigzagging as I went, to try to overhear what they were talking about. And all I heard was Connie asking my father, does he go up to Mars before or after he publishes the famous paper with all the little Martian critters in it? And I don't know what my dad said. I think he said after. So what this indicated is my dad had just been at some briefing in which my later destiny to go to Mars was revealed to him here 4 years after he first brought me into Pegasus, probably just believing that I was going to be time traveling and not literally leaving the planet via one of the devices. But that's in fact what they were now planning by 1972. 3 years after the lunar landing. Now jumping 8 years to 1980, summer of 1980, I've just done my freshman year of college at UC San Diego, and I'm going to be enrolling in UCLA in the fall of 80 as a sophomore. My dad on the left there, who was often described as looking like either Cary Grant or Phil Donahue, that was an old joke with us. My dad on the left came to me in our home in Chatsworth, California, in the living room, and said, Andy, we're going to be going on a camping trip again this year, but it's just going to be you and your dear old dad. And I said, really, Dad, where are we going? And he said, I thought we would camp on the shores of Lake Siskiyou up near Mount Shasta, which you can see on the left in this beautiful image of Shasta and Lake Siskiyou. And what's strange about that revelation of that by my dad, that approach in the living room, is that about 5 minutes into he walked into the living room and confronted me, everything stopped and went back. And that first 5 seconds of my dad approaching me, coming out of the bedroom, right side of the house, down the hallway and into the living room, it repeated. It's as if maybe the Mars jump room stuff had maybe been inserted in reality as a branch reality from the future or something, because something about my timeline got kind of jostled and it skipped or quantum glitched, and the first 5 seconds of my dad's approach repeated and the same thing happened. I don't think it was some kind of deja vu occurring as a result of brain function, because at this point my dad had not revealed to me anything more than the fact that we're going to go camping and fishing together and stuff as father and son, and that certainly didn't alarm me to any extent. My dad and I had a very good relationship as father and son and as individuals, because we've been through a lot together when I was a boy and he was, not yet 50 years old, time traveling. So I kind of welcomed the idea of a kind of a one-on-one trip with my dad, so that we might put some, some adolescent issues to rest and so forth. So I don't think that glitch occurred as a result of any anxiety of camping just with my dad. I welcomed it, but I just think it was an actual quantum glitch of some kind. Now, early, mid-August of 1980, we get up at about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, attach our boat to our, I don't know whether we still had the station wagon or a pickup truck at that point, and we drove the I-5 corridor up to the Shasta region from Southern California. It was quite a trip. When we got to the exit for McLeod, California, you make a right there off the freeway and go about 9 miles, and you reach the town of McLeod. My dad parked our vehicle and boat in what was then a very large parking lot in front of the McLeod market. And he had been driving. I mean, we used to swap driving, but at that point he was driving. And he turned to me and said, son, stay in the car. I'm going to go into the McLeod market here for about 15 minutes, and then I'm going to come out. But unless the car catches on fire, stay inside the car. And I said, okay, Dad, whatever you say. And I'm just thinking, well, he doesn't want me to leave the car and get lost or something. So he goes into the McLeod market, and as promised, comes out about 15 minutes, 20 minutes later, but he has a 5-day growth of beard. Now, my dad had white hair beginning at age 16, It runs in my family. I'm now white-haired. Oh. And as you can see here. But when we would camp, even when he was well into his 50s, he would develop kind of a primarily black beard with kind of salt and pepper with a little white in it, kind of like Ernest Hemingway. We used to kid him about looking like Ernest Hemingway and call him Papa for Papa Hemingway when we were camping. But so he comes out of the McLeod Market and he's Papa Hemingway with a full beard, or 5-day growth towards a full beard. And I said, Dad, what's going on? He goes, what do you mean? And I said, well, you went to the market, came out 50 minutes later like you promised, but you got a beard now. Something happened. And he said, oh, son, how when we're camping, I always grow my beard. You kidding me about looking like Ernest Hemingway. Okay, so the market had clearly created some kind of segue to some underground base or something in which my dad had spent 5 or 6 days in some kind of seminar, I would presume. And then he was jumped back in time so that the time loop he had been on, in which he had grown the 5-day growth of beard, was closed, and now he was back with me in real time. So now what do we know about Shasta? We know that there's a deep underground military base that you can get access to through the Shasta Dam. So what could have happened is he just went through the McLeod Market, stepped into an automobile, and was taken to the Shasta Dam, went into some 5-day conference under the dam, or in the dome underneath Shasta, or under Mount Shasta, and then taken back to McLeod Market, so he came out in 15 minutes. That would have happened in time, but he had to have gotten egress to some non-ordinary environment, because William Stillings and I have reconnoitered the McLeod Market, and we couldn't see any evidence of something that may have had the dual use of a teleport or whatever. So I think the market was just an access point to something more sophisticated. Maybe it had a stairwell that went down into the dome, or some corridor below it that you could use to get to the dome beneath Mount Shasta, for which we know the Shasta Dam is one of the access points. But that's what happened. Now, unbeknownst to me, as was revealed to me after April 23rd of 2010, when I was contacted by William Stillings, seen here on the right, he had a similar experience at that time. Oh, hold on. Brett was then in junior high school. He was 13 years of age in summer of '80. His father, Thomas J. Stillings, who didn't work at Parsons, in fact, he worked at Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, California, another major aerospace contractor, major defense contractor, took him to the McLeod Market, shaved in the car, went into the market saying, stay with the car, I'll be out in 15 minutes. And then Brett describes how when his dad came out, he had like a 2-day growth of beard because he had shaved, in the car. So we both had the same strange experience. Now Brett and I would then meet later that day, and I do remember that after my dad went to the McLeod Market, he later drove the car a short distance in McLeod, and went to a public phone and placed a phone call. I'm thinking that maybe he called Brett's father and said, you better shave before you go to the McLeod Market, because Andy detected my 5-day growth of beard quite readily. But anyway, kind of a strange coincidence, or not such a coincidence. Brett and I had that same bizarre episode at the McLeod Market with our dads, just as our Mars experiences were beginning. Now, we were there in the campsite on the northern shore of Lake Siskiyou for a Saturday and a Sunday. On Saturday, right after we met, my dad and I were at the campground, and then Brett and his father showed up in their pumpkin-colored Vanagon that I've been able to identify in Brett's Polaroid snapshots from that era. And they took up occupation of the campground next to us and propped up their Vanagon. And after we got, when Tom and Brett first came over to our campsite to introduce himself primarily to me, he first introduced himself to my father and said, you don't know me, but we work for the same company. Now that, of course, was spook speak. People attached to CIA refer to the CIA as the company. And the company can fund anything that's approved. So presumably the company has an overlay with the Knights Templar and international banking sources and so forth, the Vatican, because the CIA is not funded exclusively by the US Congress. The CIA has unlimited funding. And so we're talking, and we're sitting in lawn chairs talking for an hour or two. And then Tom Stillings sends his son, William Brett Stillings, back to their van. And Brett comes back with a shoebox with a piece of metal in it about the size of a chalk eraser and about as thick as a thick quesadilla, maybe, I don't know, a quarter of an inch, a half of an inch maybe. And he turns to my father and says, Ray, I don't have to show this to you because you work with this material, but I want to show it to Andy. Brett's seen it. So Tom takes this 2-inch by 6-inch by quarter-inch piece of metal that looks like a piece of oxidized aluminum that had just fallen off of a lawn chair, and says, check this out, Andy. And he drops it, and it hovers about 3 inches off of the ground. He then explained that some of the ET craft and our own anti-gravitic craft are not anti-gravitic, they're reverse magnetic. They're based on exposing to the ground and the shed the same magnetic polarity. That's why they hover without any danger of falling from the sky. So that revealed that Parsons and the aerospace contractors that my dad was then consulting were already working on these lighter-than-air TRB-38 type, or whatever they're called, triangular craft that make no sound and hover and so forth, by 1980. The second thing that happened that night around the campfire at about 10 o'clock. My dad looked at me and then looked over at Brett, looked back at me and said, boys, we're not just going to be camping here this summer. You're going to be taking a seminar over at the local community college, which was College of the Siskiyous. And I said, what about, Dad? And he said, everything and anything to do with Mars. And I said, Dad, I don't really want to take a seminar about Mars. I covered my astronomy at UC San Diego last school year, my breadth requirement in science. I don't want to become, the most ironic thing I said is, I don't want to become an astronaut. I'm going to be a history major at UCLA in the fall. I want to be a journalist, maybe a lawyer. And he says, no, son, you have to attend this seminar, this class that you and Brett are going to be enrolled in on Monday. And I said, why is that, Dad? And he looked at me very seriously and said, because some of you kids in the program, namely the educational program that summer, are going to be going there. And Brett and I looked at each other kind of like we were in Survivor and hadn't won the immunity challenge. We looked at each other like we were in trouble. Okay, so by the way, can you still hear me?
Yeah. Yes, you are fine too.
Okay, great. So my dad reveals Saturday night that we're going to be enrolled in a Mars training course, basically a curriculum involving Mars, because some of the kids in the class are going to be going to the planet Mars. The next Sunday, we're still kind of processing that information. And promptly at 1 p.m., Tom Stillings and my dad, Ray Basiago, stand up and they start walking to an adjacent campsite. Brett being 13 and me being 18, and in the prime of our physical fitness, we kind of skip ahead of our fathers and we go between a car and either a pickup truck or a camper that's kind of choking the front driveway of this particular campsite. And as we run through there, we're confronted by the man occupying the campsite with a male friend of his. And it is astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin meets us, and this is what he says. This is a verbatim quote. So we're startled because we just run into Buzz Aldrin, not in his spacesuit, but just in his blue jeans and a t-shirt, so to speak, in a polo shirt, basically camping. And astronaut Aldrin sort of comes out from behind the cars, or between the cars, and we're sort of just on the threshold of this campsite there. And he says, Andy, Brett, pleased to meet you fellas. You boys, he says, you boys are going to be doing something in a short while that I did a few years back, and that's go off planet. And let me tell you, boys, it's going to be the experience of a lifetime. So then our fathers catch up, and they exchange pleasantries with astronaut Aldrin. Brett kind of shake his hand. We're kind of a little bit nervous now that the second man to land on the moon is telling us we go off planet. So now it has a reality that it didn't have the previous day. But for some reason they had Buzz Aldrin greet us, I guess to edify Brett and I, maybe other participants, about the fact that you can go into space, go to another planet, land on it, and return safely to the Earth, which is in fact what Apollo 11 did with astronaut Aldrin aboard, even though he had to use a big pen to pull up on the mechanism to launch the top of the lunar module off the surface of the moon. Okay, next day, Monday morning, we fix breakfast together, and then the four of us go up to the College of the Siskiyous Extension Building in Wairika, California. At that time, there was nothing around it, and it had an open atrium in the center. Now that has been closed off with the lobby, and there's several blocks of houses and other businesses and so forth around this location. We go through the center part of the school to a classroom over the left side of the horseshoe. And we meet our instructor, Major Ed Dames. Ed Dames, as I don't know if Laura's in attendance yet at the conference today, but because I can't see, but at this time, Ed Dames was a scientific and technical intelligence officer for the U.S. Army, but when Laura Eisenhower, William Billings, and I were on Coast to Coast AM on November 10th of 2011, Ed Dames called in to deny that he was our instructor, but his participation in the program had then been verified by my eyewitness testimony and that of William Stillings and Bernard Mendez, and now has been confirmed also by a fourth whistleblower who had contact with Dames, that being William Whitecrow of Redding, California. When Ed Dames called into Coast, the first thing he suggested was that maybe we had interacted with him in a parallel reality. One of the interesting correspondences between our accounts about what happened that summer, namely Ed Dames and the jumpers who remember him being our instructor, is that he said he couldn't have been our instructor in summer of '80 because he had already been restationed in Germany, where he was monitoring Soviet troop movements on the Czech border. We remember that as our program was coming to a completion, he revealed that his girlfriend from Valencia, California, a young blonde woman named Marion, was going to break up with him because she didn't want to move to Germany, because he was going to be restationed in Germany at the end of the summer. There was also a woman present at the jump room site that Brett and I interacted with, who I later became involved with interpersonally years later, decades later, who denies being there. I don't want to provide her name because she'd rather not be part of the story. But that individual was in California that summer. She was in Southern California with the singer Randy California. So now, I respect everybody's account, and in fact, I'm elaborating on this point to show that Ed Dames may have been correct. Maybe we were part of the people who were in the jump room program were part of a branch reality that had somehow been opened up as an insertion into the timeline. Because after all, when my dad first approached me about camping in Shasta, I had that 5-second glitch where everything stopped and then repeated what had just happened. And then we have Brett, Bernard Mendez, and William Whitecrow and I remember training and going to Mars together and so forth. But not Whitecrow, he didn't train with us. But the three of us remembered Ed Dames being our instructor. And then a later love interest was there, mine was there that summer. So maybe we were in some kind of quantum interregnum that had sort of been opened up through some kind of means, from the Martians, from the God consciousness, maybe from U.S. time travel specialists in the future, maybe even the CIA did so. It opened up kind of a period of additional time that summer where those of us who remember being in the jump room program were, and yet some of the people we were interacting with were some version of themselves existing on that timeline. I'm just suggesting that that's a rational explanation for the denials we've gotten from Ed Dames and from my future girlfriend that they weren't there at College of the Siskiyous with us in summer of '80. Guess what? We all remember them being there. Brett even interacted with my future girlfriend, so can corroborate my memory of that. Ed explained that we were going to go through every aspect of Mars that we needed to know if any of us was selected to jump and go there. So it was everything from the creation of Mars cosmically, through its geology, its hydrology, its biology, its sociology, and so forth, and he was an excellent instructor. So if it wasn't the Ed Dames that is the remote viewing pioneer that you can pay $350 to do a weekend seminar with in Laughlin, I don't know who it was because he was calling himself Major Ed Dames. He looked like the same Ed Dames, and he was a very intelligent human being who was a phenomenal educator. And we've actually, Brett and I have actually publicly thanked Ed Dames for being such a fine instructor that we survived our experiences on Mars. We attribute that survival most of all to Major Ed Dames. So we still are holding out the olive branch of consultation with Ed, because after calling into Coast to Coast when Laura and Brett and I were on in November of 2011 and suggesting parallel reality and then denying he was there and then saying that I was delusional and then having me cut off the air when he began a swearing streak. He was so angry that we were suggesting that he was our Mars training officer, that is Brett and I were. I've never had a sit-down discussion with him, and I think he and I really should be, because we may find, in fact, that the Mars Jumper program did take place on a branch reality that the Ed that we now know, or my future girlfriend, were not part of. It's entirely possible. In fact, when we're having ordinary experiences with others, we're only having semi-overlapping experiences, because we are all born in a different time-space place, and we all move in and out of experiences at different times. Like you might get a couple of college friends meeting in their dorm or some plaza on campus, and then one person leaves to go to class earlier, and the other two continue their discussion. So in other words, even when we're having ordinary experiences, we're all not on the same timeline. We're on semi-overlapping timelines or realities. So I'm still holding up the possibility that only recently has quantum physics allowed, which is that when Ed and I disagree, it doesn't necessarily mean that one of us is wrong or both of us are wrong. It may mean that both of us are right, and that those of us who remember the Mars jump room experiences remember them because we were in them, but Ed wasn't. Just some version of him from another timeline was the Ed Dames who was teaching us. So after being at the extension building for COS in Wairika for about a week or so, maybe a couple days, we then moved over to the life science, first to the bungalows, and then the life sciences building on the College of the Siskiyous campus in Weed, California, right there on the volcanic apron of beautiful and sacred Mount Shasta, my favorite place in the world. Now, Ed explained that there were three major goals of why we had been enrolled in what they were calling the Mars Jump Room program. And it was clear we were working for CIA, but we would not be paid and we would not be benefited. And so I would be cheap financially and in terms of life advantage, just as I've been time traveling for 4 years in childhood. So I basically have 8 years of uncompensated service to the United States government that hasn't been compensated in anything but medical problems and the incredulity of fools denying that I did what I did. But both are true stories, as I think the people gathered today understand. So what were the three major goals of the second secret defense project that I was on? The first goal was to establish an extraterrestrial defense regime protecting the Earth. And I think that was from all of the above, not just hostile ETs, potentially hostile ETs, but asteroids that might again strike Mars and Earth as they did in 9500 BC, and so forth. Basically put a defense base on the planet Mars to protect Earth, because after all, to the extent that Mars moves in and out of closeness, proximity that is, to Earth on a 2-year basis in its irregular orbit around the Sun, that creates an excellent situation where Mars can kind of be used as a defense platform, protecting our planet as we make our our regular and true orbit, our circular orbit around the sun. It was also, the second goal was to create a basis for claiming U.S. territorial sovereignty over Mars. So, in pursuit of those three goals of establishing a defense regime on Mars, doing what needed to be done to be able to assert a U.S. claim to territorial sovereignty over Mars by sending settlers and temporary visitors there, and also acclimating the Martian humanoids and animals to our Earthling presence on their planet, there were three major emphases. We were instructed by Major Dames what to expect upon arriving on Mars via the jump rooms, to learn about the lethal and non-lethal predators that we might encounter or were likely to encounter, and how to operate as a team on the surface so as to survive. So one of the funny things that we did is we had to describe something in a loud, staccato voice that was as accurate as possible, but with the fewest words as possible. And so Ed Dames put a glass of water on a green bar stool, and Regina Dugan went up to it and said, "A glass full of water on a stool, sitting there." And then we used that on the surface. So those were the three emphases. Now, there were 10 teenagers that William Stillings and Bernard Mendes and I have been able to identify were in our class. The first was William Stillings, as I mentioned, then age 13, a technical genius, somebody who had been repairing television sets from age 4 without instruction. I think they probably involved Brett because if the jump room itself broke down when we were on Mars, he might be able to fix it with a screwdriver, as he has my cell phone. And here's Brett today, living in California. Another one of our classmates was a young undergraduate my age who had just done a year of college, whose name was Barry Satoro, but today who we know as President Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States. Now, we'll see there were many other illustrious individuals involved, and we can speculate as to the reasons, but it is true, Mr. Obama was one of the Mars jumpers, and we're not going to back down from that assertion because it's true. It is the case. Another was Regina Dugan, who had just done her freshman year at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, having entered as a 16-year-old. Another brainiac to have done so. Here's Regina in 2009, around the time that President Obama appointed her the 19th director of DARPA, the very agency that gave America its time travel potential, and the first woman to hold that position. And a future astronaut per se, William Cameron McCool, who was one of the Annapolis students enrolled. Willie McCool, as we knew him, was a contemporary of Barack Obama and I. Barry, as we knew Barack, was 45 days older than me, and I was in turn 5 days older than Willie McCool, who would go on to become a space shuttle pilot after serving as a test pilot for the US Navy, who would tragically lose his life aboard the re-entry of Space Shuttle Columbia to Earth's atmosphere on February 1st of 2003. So we know 5. We don't know the other 5. We have some understanding that one of the other participants may have been named Eric Schoenfeld or Schoenfeld from San Mateo, California, but we have been unable to locate him. I also, by the way, spoke to Baron McCool, the father of Willie McCool, who is a professor of business at Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas, and he did not return my voicemails, even after I stated that I was a lawyer admitted at the state and federal level in the state of Washington and had served with his son in a secret space program project. And Dr. McCool chose not to communicate with me, and that's That's a tragedy, because I could have filled him in about the Mars jumper program. And the fact that Willie had actually landed on another planet, not just traveled in space. And I wanted to brief him on what the information that we had collected. Okay, so we don't know who the other 5 are. Eric's a bit of a lead, a research lead, but we don't know about the other 4. I remember that they were surprisingly conservative politically for such a bright group of people. Now, curiously, of the 5 that we've been able to identify, each of us had a Pasadena, California connection, from which we can infer that NASA JPL may have been involved in our selection. So here's beautiful Pasadena, California. Okay, first of all, I was the son of a career engineer for the Ralph F. Parsons Company. My father was employed as a special projects engineer for Parsons of Pasadena from 1966 to 84, and continued to consult on time travel until his death in 1990. My father was essentially the point man between, or chief technical consultant, between Parsons and the CIA on the theory and practice of Tesla teleportation. This is the central building at Parsons. If anybody is ever in Pasadena and wants to walk over there to the Parsons headquarters buildings at 300 West Walnut Street, Pasadena, if you stand with toward the central building, the building over on the left is exclusively classified defense work for the United States government. So imagine a building this size of 3 buildings on that 6-acre campus in Pasadena for Parsons, in which a building this size is all classified defense work. Could a company like Parsons that built an entire city from scratch called Yambui on the Saudi coast for the Saudi regime, or design and manufacture the MX missile system, where our intercontinental ballistic missiles would be transported on trains? Could they put U.S. personnel on Mars via a space elevator? I think so. I mean, they've been involved in very advanced activity for many decades. The second Pasadena connection is that Barry Soetoro, as we knew President Obama, was then attending Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, which is a suburb of Pasadena. I mentioned that Regina Dugan had just attended a year at Caltech in Pasadena on her way to a PhD in 1993 that was either in mechanical engineering or in quantum physics, covered under the descriptor mechanical engineering. We don't know what she qualified as a PhD in.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and lastly, of the 5 Pasadena connections, William Cameron McCool would go on to become a NASA JPL astronaut, and of course, they have a major facility there in Pasadena. So all 5 of us have Pasadena, California connections. I think all that we can infer is that it probably meant that there was some team of sociologists or human factors experts at NASA JPL who were selecting the participants based on a set of criteria that I'm going to reveal later in today's talk. And here they are, the 7 traits that Bernard Mendez claims we were selected on the basis of as jumpers were the following: very high intelligence, a team orientation, non-competitive personalities. They wanted people who would say, let's walk up that hill over there, rather than people who would race up the hill and say, beach at the top of the hill, right? And that we had an affinity for nature, represented in things like family or personal camping trips, an interest in ecology, which was certainly the case for myself, and so forth, that we were intuitive problem solvers. Brett can basically repair anything with a screwdriver. I had an episode in childhood where the spring on our trailer that we were towing our boat with snapped while we were driving. And my dad he took me aside and said, okay, Andrew, what do you think we should do? And I said, well, if it's a spring, Dad, why don't we find a springy piece of wood in the woods and just slide the spring out and slide, let's say, a sapling underneath that. Maybe we could get to the closest garage. And we did. In fact, we got 200 miles on the length of sapling that one of my brothers went into the woods with a hatchet, chopped down, and we just inserted it next to the metal spring that had snapped and pulled the pieces of that out, and we were good to go. So I had somewhat of a background in intuitive problem solving. And then Bernard also mentioned that they wanted individuals with a sense of grandiosity because they were going to another planet. So they wanted not so much egotistical people, but people who liked themselves and wanted to live large and wouldn't be intimidated by the experience of leaving Earth. And then they also seem to have selected, as we'll find later in today's talk, for a future leadership profile, because many of the participants went on to become political leaders of one kind or the other. And I think you'd be very interested in who was involved in terms of the leadership quotient. Okay, now 3 parents would end up auditing all or most of the lectures that Ed Ames gave. First, my father. My dad attended all of the lectures, sitting with me. As I mentioned, chief technical consultant between Parsons and the CIA and teleportation. My dad held a BS in electrical engineering from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the world's leading engineering curriculum, class of 1951. He was admitted to Eta Kappa Nu, the Engineering Honor Society. He worked on the ramjet, the metallurgy of the ramjet engine at Curtiss Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey, 1952 to 55. And he repeated Nikola Tesla's teleportation experiments at the Edison Labs in West Orange, New Jersey, where he was employed from 1956 to 64. So by the time that the Mars Jump Room program was launched, my dad was a principal contributor to the theory and practice, basically, of time travel, and would have understood the technology we were using to get to Mars. Then, of course, William Stillings' father, Thomas J. Stillings, was a former Navy officer. There's the Navy involvement in time travel, who, like my father, had a BS in engineering from Ohio State. He was an operations analyst at Lockheed Skunk Works. I think that Tom may have designed the program operationally. He had been a lieutenant in the Navy, assigned to the Office of Naval Research, which was involved in using me as a child psychic on Project Pegasus. You may recall my accounts of officers from the Office of Naval Intelligence, naval lieutenant commanders coming into my school and involving the kids who would time travel for Pegasus in remote viewing activities. As I like to say, on Project Pegasus, we were small mediums at large, and those are the kids who ended up getting tapped for time travel by Pegasus. Like myself, Tom had graduate training from the Naval Postgraduate School. I don't know where he obtained that, probably in Monterey, California, but I attended about 36 units of advanced mathematics from the Naval Postgraduate School when I was getting my BA in history from UCLA, and in fact I turned down the BS in advanced math I was supposed to have been awarded, because that's what we were instructed to do, is deny the validity of the degree. So I gave up a double baccalaureate at UCLA because the individual running that academic program instructed us to do so, to keep our education from the Naval Postgraduate School secret, basically. And I mentioned also his NASA JPL connection. Also attending virtually all the programs and even giving a 2 or 3 hour lecture on cross-cultural communications, in which she shared with us what she learned about cross-cultural communications. Married first to a Kenyan gentleman and then an Indonesian, was Stanley Ann Dunham, who is alleged to be the mother of Barack Obama, but who I believe was his adopted mother, because when Barack Obama's genetics were tested by British intelligence in 2008 from a glass that he had drunk from when he was visiting England, they found that he had no genetic markers for an Anglo-Saxon mother. In other words, the markers in his matrilineal DNA were not consistent with Anglo-Saxon ancestry. And Stanley Ann Dunham was a Dunham, which is from the British landed gentry. So I think despite the physical resemblance between Barack Obama and Stanley Ann Dunham, I don't think that she was his mom. I think she was his adopted mother, and to some extent his handler on behalf of the CIA. If she was his mother, biologically speaking, she certainly was his handler, in a sense the way my father was my handler in childhood and adolescence. She was a brilliant woman who we all admired greatly in our interactions with her. She was a very sophisticated and intelligent woman. She had worked as a consultant for the U.S. Agency for International Development in Kenya and Indonesia, where she married her foreign-born husbands. She would go on to earn a PhD in anthropology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, I believe in 1993, as did Regina, earned her degree that year. She is alleged to have been an agent for the CIA, and I mentioned her expertise in cross-cultural communications. I was very impressed by her. I think she was almost a Margaret Mead kind of intellect in anthropology. Her 2 or 3 hour lecture to us one afternoon, with her son not present, was brilliant. It was nothing short of brilliant. It's what you would expect if you were going to some lecture by a Margaret Mead or a Gregory Bateson or some other brilliant anthropologist. She certainly knew her stuff. So the president grew up the son or adoptive son of a brilliant mother. Now, we have to examine this question of the fact that there was a future president in our midst, and that was Barry Soetoro, as we knew him, with Barack Obama then using his Indonesian name. The first interaction outside of class I had with Barry is we were walking out of class, and he said, you know, I really have to pinch myself sometimes, because do you realize we're going to be doing something that few human beings on Earth have ever done, and that's go off planet? And I said, I know. It's just, some days like class ends and my head is reeling because I can't believe what they're preparing us for. We know that Barry Soetoro was Barack Obama because his kindergarten teacher in Indonesia has identified him as the boy standing in the second row from the top over on the far left with the red indicated by the red circle. And she also released to the press his cumulative record from his grammar school in Indonesia, where he's identified as Barry Soetoro and an adherent to the Muslim faith. He is, in fact, a Muslim because when I came into the dorm room we shared during our training, I found him prostrate, praying to Mecca at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, dressed in a red shirt and white mufti. So he then explained he was an adherent not so much to Islam, but an Islamic sect, kind of a branch of Islam, known as the Subud group, or the Subud movement. We have the fact that in photographs in President Obama's own, from his own, that he provided, for example, when he ran for president in 2008, those photographs show him with the woman we met, Stanley Ann Dunham. So Barry Soetoro can be identified as Barack Obama on the basis of his own features, his own resemblance to the young man that we were trained with and jumped to Mars with, and that of his alleged mother, Stanley Ann Dunham. And we got to know Barry very well. I mentioned that I roomed with him for a short period. In addition to Barry, Regina Dugan and William Stillings and I and our parents moved from the dorms at College of the Siskiyous to the Finlandia Motel in Mount Shasta City, California. And so we really got to know him, just as you would get to know somebody by going to college with them or serving on jury duty. I mean, we really got to know each other. And I know that the person who's president was that person. You just know who you've met, you know who you've befriended. Okay, now, in addition to the sitting president being one of the jumpers, and again, I use this as a proof of the validity of our account, if we were making up a story and wanted to be believed, would we ever have stated that the current sitting president of the United States was one of the jumpers? I mean, Richard Dolan is out there telling everybody in his snide voice how Andy Basiago, he always adds several syllables to my Polish surname. I am Italian on my other side, but to my Polish surname. And has literally made a cause out of this fact that somehow I've besmirched ufology or exopolitics, but with my Obama on Mars story. Well, I haven't been telling an Obama on Mars story. I've been including President Obama among the Mars jumpers because he was. Because we decided that we shouldn't lie. We decided that if we denied the fact that Obama was one of the jumpers, when it was later revealed that he was, we would be accused of waging a public limited hangout, a disinformation campaign on behalf of CIA, on behalf of the Obama administration, or Mr. Obama personally. Nothing of the sort happened. All that happened is we resolved to bring every attribute of our Mars jump experiences that we could remember and agree upon forward. And that included the fact that Barry Soetoro was one of our fellows. That's all that happened. It's not an Obama Mars story. It may be in the mind of Richard Dolan, but I would urge Richie Dolan to dig a little bit more deeper into my material and see the fact that it's just an incidental, it's just a coincidence that the current president was one of the jumpers, and it really harmed our ability to tell the story and be believed. For example, when I was covered on the Colbert Report, I was invited to appear on that show based on a representation made by Stephen Colbert's producer, Jeff Cooperman, formerly of NBC, whose wife was a partisan of Hillary Clinton, by the way, that they would interview me in a straight interview, a non-comedic interview, about teleportation as a means for getting our country off of reliance on Middle Eastern oil and the necessity to fight wars of resource acquisition in the Middle East in pursuit of that oil. And instead, they did a piece in which they made fun of me in light of my claims that President Obama was one of the Mars jumpers. He was, we all agree on it, and we're going to continue to tell the truth of the fact that, yes, that's part of his background that he should admit to, but he hasn't. Now, we also have to examine the fact that there was an incident involving the suggestion, the possibility, that there were two future presidents in the program, namely Barry and myself. Now, how did that happen? What happened is, we had some downtime in class. I was sitting in front of my father in the row of seats. Brett was across from me, and Tom Stillings was sitting behind his son. And in front of Brett was Barry Soetoro, or also known as Barack Obama. And so we started the break from class, and Barry got up and walked up to consult something, ask something of Ed Dames. And as he did so, Tom Stillings leaned forward and said to his son, Brett, how do you feel being in a Mars program like this with a future president? Kind of indicating Barry, as Barry was walking up to the front of the classroom. And before William Stillings could answer, my father, again sitting behind me, thrust two fingers into the aisle between he and I and the Stillings, and looking at me said, two future presidents. And as my father said that, made that gesture, his right eye began twitching. The muscle underneath the right eye began twitching, which was a nervous tic that my father had every time he was emotionally agitated by something. And Brett has said that later that day when his father was driving back to the dorm or the hotel or wherever, walking to the dorm or one of the hotels that we were sometimes at, he said, why would they be putting two future presidents in this program? Okay, now, my point here is not to suggest that, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me say that, okay, later in the course of the summer training program, my father and I drove Barry Soetoro up to the airport, the small connector airport, at the Hoopa Indian Reservation north of College of the Siskiyous, because Barry wanted to connect to Portland, Oregon, to fly to Hawaii, to take a break from our course to visit his grandparents on the island of Oahu. And when we were driving back, when we had dropped Barry off at the airport, and I remember how my dad was gripping the wheel, because he certainly believed that there were two future presidents, all of 18, 19 years old in the car with him. And we were driving back. I said, Dad, do I really become president someday? And he said, yep. And I said, when? And he said, after Barry does. What I can tell you is, he becomes president in his late 40s, and you're one of the presidents after him. And you're significantly older when you reach the White House. So as of summer 1980, my dad believed, or had been told, or they had found the footage, or he had analyzed the stuff we discovered around Pegasus, like when we were studying my future at Sandia in the second half of the summer of '71, multiple means, but my dad certainly was now revealing to me that just as Barry was being spoken openly as a future president during our training course, that I also was a future president. So here's my campaign portrait from 2016. Should the blue have had stars? Yes, but remember, this was my first attempt to be elected president. I can be forgiven for leaving the stars out of the blue on the flag behind me. So anyway, so that's what my dad believed. Does it have to happen? No. Did the CIA believe as of summer of '80 that I was a future president? Yes. And I can say, after running in 2016, that it is very difficult to be elected president. At this point, it takes over $1 billion. Look at how the two wealthiest candidates got the party nominations and almost tied with the popular vote, or both the popular and the electoral vote. Donald Trump is worth about $4 billion. Bill and Hillary Clinton are worth about $100 billion accumulated dollars in the Clinton Foundation. All of which, unlike Mr. Trump's real estate holdings, is liquid because it's just money sitting in bank accounts that they've accumulated in the international scavenger capitalism that they've engaged in since leaving the White House. Okay, like stealing the people of Haiti of their foreign aid money and so forth. Okay, so I'm not anti-Clinton because I'm disgusted by Mr. Trump, a man who would ridicule a man with a disabled arm and make fun of him and emulate his disability. As a man at 70 years of age, would make fun of a disabled person on stage. I was disgusted by both of the candidates, but it's not a coincidence that the two wealthiest got the party nominations and vied for the presidency. And here we have President-elect Trump. Okay, now we have to ask ourselves, why send two future presidents to Mars? One possibility is they wanted to prepare Barry and I for the presidency by subjecting us to experiences involving high stress, and certainly trying to stay alive on a desert planet millions of miles from Earth where there are 6 or 7 predators is high stress. Even leaving Mother Earth is stressful. One of the space shuttle astronauts had a panic attack and was in such existential panic that she had to be medicated into unconsciousness and zipped up in her sleeping bag. So these stories aren't told, but I can say that there is a certain grinding existential dread, or maybe it's the change in resonance frequency, in the sense that Mars didn't have the Schumann resonance of Earth that I had become accustomed to during the first 20 years of my life. But it was certainly something that provoked kind of a mild grinding panic being off of Mother Earth. And so that was very stressful. That was certainly stressful, presumably more stressful than anything involving the presidency will be. Or at least it was similar to the high stress of serving as president. That would also toughen us, because look, with today's presidency, you have to be a nerd from other people's opinion of you, because just by being elected president, you have half the country hating you, and then while you're serving, no matter what you do, you're being criticized. So you have to have a strong resolve to be president, and I think in his own quiet way, President Obama has shown us that resolve. I'm a little bit more of an Oxford type of person. I'm a little more stolid in my approach to stress, a little bit more combative. But I think we both possess a high degree of resolve that may have become part of our personalities when we were required to psychologically prepare to travel to another planet in the solar system and then return. In the case of both of us, about 40 times round trip. So I think they were toughening us for the presidency. Another possibility is that the project was so sensitive on an interplanetary basis that they wanted to select those who would one day be entrusted with great responsibility. That would be just a way of prospecting the society for super responsible types that they could trust when we were on Mars and interacting with the Martian humanoids, for example. Another reason might be that it was anticipated that during our presidencies, Earth-Mars relations would accelerate in some way. For example, the Martian humanoids would relocate to Earth, as apparently they want to because of the conditions on Mars. And then a fourth possibility I was thinking about, it's a little bit far out, but it may be the case on some level, is that because they were using quantum access to predict who the future presidents would be, they could infer that among the jumpers, Barry and I would survive. Barry and I and anybody we were jumping with in a particular jump would survive those jumps because they knew our future presidencies would take place. And they could interpolate backwards and select future presidents to maximize the number of people who survive the jumping. Or some combination of these four explanations. Now, about a week before the program ended, Ed Dames, my father, approached Barry, Regina, and I, and informed us that they were going to jump us backward in time to June of 1980 from August, and we were going to spend 2 weeks in seclusion at College of the Siskiyous in an annex to the college library, and be living in sort of dorm facilities there in separate rooms. Here's Barry at Harvard Law School, Regina after she became a public figure after getting her PhD in mechanical engineering from Caltech and becoming the director of DARPA. And here's me in my Cambridge graduation portrait. So they picked individuals who would acquire advanced education from top schools and become public intellectuals. I find that commonality interesting because, again, it suggests that they were using quantum access to identify us in the future and then involve us in this particular exercise. The exercise was to be sequestered there for 2 months, and then when those 2 months ended, we would rejoin our class in real time. And we did. But during those 2 months, we were reading and analyzing about 4 to 5 inches of French intelligence documents collected by the Republic of France's External Intelligence Organization. Here's its logo over on the left. And I remember seeing this on some of the documents. To write our personal thesis, which in turn would be included in a threat assessment that the CIA was then preparing on whether or not the Martian humanoid civilization presented a threat to our human civilization on Earth. In those documents was an account that in 1964, 2 American astronauts crash-landed on Mars via rocket. We got in touch with the Martian humanoid civilization, which implies that we were already in touch with them. They agreed to rescue our 2 astronauts so they wouldn't die from exposure. They then reneged, and those 2 astronauts perished. I didn't think that that indicated that the Martian humanoid civilization was a threat to us, because after all, we were the invaders, we were the hegemons on their planetary civilization. But when we were walking back to give our theses of what we had concluded to Ed Dames in his office, I asked Barry and Regina what they had concluded and revealed that I had concluded that the Martian humanoid civilization was no threat to our earthly civilization and had been rather benign in its treatment of us, given the fact that we were beginning to land astronauts there, possibly without permission. And Regina grew angry at me and said, well, what about the incident in which they didn't save our astronauts? And thought that indicated that they couldn't be trusted and could be a threat because they had promised to save the astronauts and then reneged. And I just repeated my theme that, yes, but we're the ones invading their planet. As I've said often in my truth campaign about Mars, Mars doesn't belong to us, it belongs to the Martians. So we were not just being prepared for Mars to be Mars jumpers, the 3 of us became essentially CIA analysts of the Mars humanoid civilization during that summer. So keep that in mind when you consider the fact that Barry Soetoro Obama sat in on the lectures about the biology of Mars, the biosphere of Mars with Ed Dames, and we then analyzed documents which inter alia included the assertion that 2 of our US astronauts had died on the surface of Mars. Just keep those facts in mind when later in the lecture I'll go over essentially the disinformation ploys that President Obama has launched relative to Mars. But anyway, that was summer of '80. We then rejoined our class. It went on for another week or so. The Stillings went back to Los Angeles. The rest of us met at the Creamery restaurant, which today is the Creamery Pub. If your journeys ever take you to Weed, California, have a beer in our honor at the Creamery Pub. Back in the day, it was the Creamery restaurant. It had all these fancy cream-based desserts and stuff. And it was at that dinner that Stanley Ann Dunham again revealed that her son Barry would be the first black president of the United States. So I then returned to LA with my dad, and entered UCLA for the 80-81 school year, and then in summer of 81, they put one CIA agent in my life. Courtney Maurice Hunt. Now, this isn't a picture of Courtney. It's a picture of Michael D. Roman that was believed to be by the Irish-born BBC journalist Shane O'Shaughnessy in a documentary he did about the assassination of Senator Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. It was believed by the FBI to be a picture of Courtney M. Hunt. In fact, Courtney was interviewed by FBI, but he was in Vietnam at that time, for CIA. The BBC journalist believed that this wasn't Michael D. Roman, the chairman of the Bulova Watch Company, or the president of the Bulova Watch Company, which was having a company meeting there at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles the night that Senator Kennedy was shot by Sirhan Sirhan. But it was believed to be Gordon Campbell of the CIA, and it wasn't. It was Michael Roman of the Bulova Watch Company. But Courtney looked like this so closely, especially around age 50 when he entered my life, that it's almost an identical match to his appearance. So I'm using that because I don't have yet a photograph of Courtney. Among the things Courtney and I did in summer of 81 is he took me to a chemistry lab over at Cal State University Northridge and showed me how to use the respirator that I might be using on Mars. He also took me to Lockheed Skunk Works to this video array that had scenes from Mars, and they were inserting this is the Lockheed Skunk Works logo, nothing on Mars, but they had little images of like dinosaur-like predators, and I had to hold this metal gun and every 30 seconds turn either 90 degrees to the left or right or 180 degrees, basically reverse. So there were video screens on all four sides of me, and there was this woman with this lovely British accent saying, now turn 90 degrees to your left. Now make a 180 and look at this. Is there anything behind you? So they were just trying to sort of get, at least among those of us who would have weapons on the surface, to protect ourselves and our team members by constantly looking at 30 and 90 degree angles for potential predators approaching us. Such as this ultimately, inevitably, potentially non-lethal predator. In other words, one of the predators, one of these plesiosaurs, which we could outrun on, with our human locomotion. But also the inevitably lethal predators, like the one that had the head of a Tyrannosaurus Rex and a mouthful of jagged teeth and a more subtle velociraptor body than this dinosaur. If we got anywhere within this type, they showed us how to run around in zigzags and try to cause the predator to lose interest. But mostly, it ended up just the person who had, unfortunately, pulled the death card, as it were, getting exhausted before sitting down on the ground and being bitten alive and killed, and sometimes eaten by these predators. I witnessed that twice during my period of service on Mars. First, a 45-year-old guy named Bob was bitten in half right in front of Courtney Hunt and I, after running all over the place yelling at the animal, courageously pulling it away from his team members. And then also there was an incident involving a young Californian, a blonde kid named David, who was bitten in the midsection by a similar predator, basically another type of the same predators. So we were dealing with both inevitably lethal and not inevitably lethal predators. Because of that dichotomy, I had a photo flash gun that had 3 settings: heat, stun, and kill, that I could use on smaller predators or even on Martian humanoids. Or I was given ethical counsel that I could sit down on the ground and sacrifice myself rather than take a human or animal life form on another planet on a sanctity of life-based issue, or also not to be responsible for sparking interplanetary war. I was also given a cyanide capsule to take if I wanted to suicide rather than be eaten alive. I don't know if anybody else had those, but I always had it in my right pocket. And I always had the photo flash gun with the 3 settings tucked into my belt on the left, kind of tilted away. Because it had those 3 particular settings, oops. The watchword was when you were lighting somebody else's cigarette, do the right thing. In other words, set the photo flash gun for heat rather than kill, or you might very well, or stun, or you might very well incinerate their head off lighting a cigarette, which would certainly be something that we would want to avoid, harming one of our fellow team members on the surface. Now, in that summer of '81, when he was training me, more like technical things that I could expect on Mars, like those that I just mentioned, Courtney Hunt instructed me to transfer from UCLA to Columbia University in New York City to enter in fall of 1981. I declined. This was the second major decline to the military-industrial complex in my life, the first being declining enactments, which was probably stupid. I would have gotten a free education. And here I was declining an Ivy League school because they weren't providing any funding for traveling, and I would be stuck in New York City. And I really enjoyed my education at UCLA. I was kind of predicting that in the future, because of the emergence of the Pacific Rim nations, that UCLA, which was already more admired than the Ivy League schools in places like Japan, would probably be a more prestigious school than Columbia. And that's kind of happened, at least in terms of in Asia and the Pacific Rim. But I just didn't want to make the third collegiate transfer, UC San Diego and then UCLA, and then a year later, Columbia. But I basically turned down an Ivy League degree, which was probably foolish, but maybe in the long run, the emergence of the Pacific Rim will prove me right. Now, Barry Soetoro did make that transfer, so apparently somebody at CIA, maybe even Courtney Hunt, instructed him to do likewise. Two of his alleged classmates, Wayne Allen Root, a Las Vegas gambler who was a graduate of Columbia, and who was the vice presidential nominee of the Libertarian Party in 2008, the very election that President Obama won, and another one of their classmates in political science in Columbia, class of 1983, George Stephanopoulos of the Clinton administration and of ABC News today, did studies in which Wayne Allen Root approached 400 individuals at Columbia in the years that Obama was supposedly there, 1981 and 83. And George Stephanopoulos approached 75 poli-sci graduates from Columbia, class of 83. And neither of them could find anybody who was at Columbia in the degree program, or even living in New York City at that time, who could corroborate the claim made by Obama in Columbia that he was there for 2 years and took a poli-sci degree from Columbia. Why would this be? Because as Courtney Hunt described to me, or explained to me, when he ordered me to transfer to Columbia, our degree program at Columbia would be given to us, the degree would be given to us for very little work, and would be used primarily as an operational cover for the Mars Jump Room program and for other operations we would be doing for the Central Intelligence Agency. So with this information that Obama made the jump to Columbia, we can infer that, for example, when he went to Pakistan on his Indonesian passport in 1981, he was doing so for the CIA. Maybe that's why he's waged disinfo ploys regarding his Mars service. Now, it made sense to me for the CIA to order us to transfer to a New York university from UCLA and Occidental College in Los Angeles, respectively, because there were two jump rooms. The East Coast jump room was in the CIA complex at the George Washington Bridge area over on the New York side. So if you take this bridge, across the bridge, it was over on the left, over on the western side of the northern approach from the George Washington Bridge, the southern approach to New York City on the George Washington Bridge. And the West Coast jump room was at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California, immediately south of the Los Angeles International Airport. Let me just go back on that. We would go into the building, go into the center elevator complex, go up to the 5th floor, walk out onto the 5th floor. There was a kind of a Fijian suite there, kind of a marble countertop with one CIA employee. He would give us a book in which we would sign and write our name and provide our date of birth and our social security number and then we would go back into the elevator. The elevator would go up to the 8th floor. About 5 minutes later, we would hear a voice saying, "Are you ready to go to Mars?" And we would say, "Yes." And the first time I did this in July of '81, Courtney Hunt was on the microphone, and I was so frustrated with this delay, I said, quoting Alan Shepard from 1961, when he was eager to be launched as the first American to enter space, I said, I yelled, "Light this candle." And Courtney laughed, as only the cigarette-smoking man from the CIA can laugh, kind of ruefully. And so this building housed a space elevator. Now, I did 2 training jumps. In July of '81, I went up by myself, walked through the eye socket of a large humanoid skull on the surface. There's not just one face on Mars at Cydonia. Mars has thousands of heads, skulls, faces, masks, profiles of human beings, other humanoids, and other primates, basically simian, the heads or faces of simian life forms. They include Earthling-type faces, Martian-type faces, Gray ET-type faces, Sasquatch-type faces, and so forth. They are basically obsessed with the primate face. And on the surface that are used to indicate access points to stairwells and so forth that provide access to the underground civilization. So I went up, I walked out the eye socket, shortly thereafter I was met by 3 humans from the program, 3 Earthlings from the Mars Jump Room program. I could hear a windstorm howling in the distance, like a Scirocco. I first encountered the smell of Mars. I always felt that Mars smelled like burnt waffles in one of those old waffle irons. William Stillings did a little bit more experimentation with chemistry in childhood. He said that Mars smells like burnt nail polish remover, more of like a burnt alcohol type of smell. So I spent about an hour on the surface. At one point I was screaming to the leader, these 3 who greeted me, "Can I take off my mask," namely my respiration mask? And he was laughing because they were all not wearing their masks. And in fact, of the 3, one was female, and the woman was actually smoking. Mars has a very thin atmosphere, but it does have oxygen. Oxygen is a clear gas that refracts blue, which is why Mars has a blue sky, not a red sky. And I'm on record as having said that on the pages of Mars on Facebook, the Mars Anomaly Research Society group on Facebook, that mark my words, Mars has a blue sky, because I've been there and I've seen it. And then that was later proved by such anomalists as Paul Goodwin in the United Kingdom, Andrew R. Steck of Pennsylvania, and other distinguished anomalists of the 200 or more individuals who have posted their findings on our Facebook group, which I'm very grateful for, and very proud that our group now numbers almost 14,000 members. And then about 200 of those members have regularly posted findings of life forms and artifacts on the red planet. I think together we've done something really special, and I'm very grateful to have started the group and to have enjoyed the incredible adventure that we've had making the findings that we've had. They've certainly been more bounteous than I made personally, because Mars is such a desert planet with so few life forms that I think I've probably seen more on Mars, our findings, than I saw during the 40 or so round trips to Mars that I made in the Jump Room program. The next month, in August of '81, Courtney Hunt went with me, and we reconnoitered a stone cottage with a settler in it named Howard. And he wanted to be taken home, but Courtney told him he couldn't take me home. This was the location where the hybrid man and grub-type creature chained to a post outside the property, outside the structure, came snarling, barking, and yelling at Courtney and I, tried to intimidate us. And then Courtney kind of lunged at him, and he turned tail and went sort of barking and snarling back across the yard of this house, sort of the curtilage, relatively unvegetated curtilage of this structure. It looked very much like this. It was basically a one-room cabin cobbled together with native rock. We then went and encountered, among other life forms, a bed of flowers that had human faces in the center of the flowers. And then we walked along a road, kind of a trammeled path, and we encountered these seal or sea lion or walrus-like creatures that were laying up on the ridge. I think a lot of us have seen these sort of blubberous brown masses, particularly on hillsides on Mars. Some of those are these seal or walrus-like creatures that are just sort of sunning themselves on the surface. On a planet that has very little vegetation and very little nutrients, it apparently was adapted to be very sessile rather than mobile, in the sense that when you just lay around and don't burn energy, and then make a charge at some prey when they come near you, that's a survival strategy. So we have to remember that because it is so deficient in oxygen and so deficient in nutrients, that a lot of the life forms we're seeing are either virtually sessile, basically virtually non-moving, or slow-moving because of the biological constraints of the Martian atmosphere. Before I was given the mission, I was on about 5 sort of science missions with Bernie Mendez as team leader, in which the third man out was Barry Soetoro, and then also I was on about 5 other science missions with Courtney Hunt as team leader and William Stillings as the third man out. So then I was given a mission, and that was before going up to Mars via jump room in El Segundo, I would drive from the UCLA campus over to West Los Angeles, and at kind of a printing company there, I would meet with a man who would give me this disc that had data on it for a telecommunications outpost on Mars that had been collected by the Rand Corporation of Santa Monica, California. And that disc looked exactly like the 3.5 or 3.25 inch rigid black so-called floppy disks that emerged 10 years later in the early 90s, but they were already in use within the intelligence community. So again, a lot of these computer and software companies, they're not spin-offs of classified defense work. They're literally the commercialization of classified applications. I would take the jump room and walk to a jump room called the Corkscrew, and then walk through a dilapidated brick city and give a man in a telecommunications post with about 8 or 9 electronic devices the disk, and then walk back to the jump room and jump back to El Segundo and then drive back to UCLA. Okay, I've encountered 3 typologies of Martians. There's 5 primates on Mars, but let me show you the 3 primary ones, the important ones, the big ones. I mentioned the Homo martis terris, who look like us. I mentioned Patrick Stewart of Star Trek as an example. This would be one of the more handsome, bald, male cousins of ours on Mars, the descendants of the humans who were Earthlings who were on Mars before the solar system catastrophe. This one was drawn by the Sedona, Arizona artist Elizabeth Silk, almost as a kind of a police sketch type approach, based on my description of the Martian pilot or astronaut who said goodbye to my father back in summer of '70. She called him Sar, which was pretty close to the way his name sounded. He had that kind of Robin Williams twinkle in his eye. Then there's the Homo martis martis, who are sort of a little bit more ghoulish. They have the classic Martian head with pointy ears. Some of them have antennae, which aren't metallic, but are little sort of protuberances that extend out of the temples as a sensing device. It's a multimodal sense organ, the antennae that these type have. Large, kind of sad, deeply sunken eyes, and a kind of a mischievous or mirthful mouth, and then a spindly body, and a very shy, recondite personality. And these are the Homo martis martis, who were the indigenous Martians when our ancestors reached Mars back in the first civilization that built the Great Pyramid of Sphinx. So this is the type that greeted Courtney Hunt and I at the mouth of the Corkscrew and took us on a brief tour of their underground civilization, which is kind of a Tolkien-esque. Imagine, let's say, the Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, natural caverns equipped with electronic devices and pneumatically assisted tubing, and that sort of thing. But executed in an artistically kind of fanciful way, almost like Antonio Gaudi's architecture around Barcelona, Spain, in Barcelona. You know, flying balustrades and ceilings made with paisley designs, a kind of a storybook, kind of Tolkien-esque, but yet technically assisted, cavernous underground civilization is what they live in there. And then on top of the corkscrew one time, I saw one of the Homo marctus extraterrestrialis, the ones who resemble the great ETs. There's also a Bigfoot on Mars called Homo marctus sasquatchus, and these tiny little ones that we call Homo marctus de minimis, which were first discovered in the anomaly field by Dave Beamer in around 2006. So maybe my claim to be the first to publish life forms on Mars was in fact as a credit that goes to Dave Beamer. Okay, the next section is I want to go through the 8 Mars whistleblowers, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. The first jumper to step forward is Michael C. Ralph, who in the late 90s, based on psychiatric and sort of hypnosis-based clearing sessions that he did with his wife Stephanie Ralph, recovered his Mars memories and testified that he spent from 1976 to 1996 on Mars, and then was age-regressed 20 years and time traveled back in time, and then discharged back in the conventional army and honorably discharged. So Michael C. Ralph was the first of the Mars jumpers to come forward. He was followed in the middle 20s. I don't know the precise date. It was in the, I think in the 2006 and 7 time frame, by the Henry Deacon informant to Bill Ryan and Carrie Cassidy at Project Camelot, whose real name is Arthur Neumann, who stated that he had just been up relatively recently to Mars via a jump room as an employee of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in Livermore, California, near Berkeley, which is basically one of our nuclear labs. And he wants me to emphasize, he was angry at me, he wants me to emphasize that he's never been employed by the CIA. Indeed, Arthur went up there for another agency, namely Lawrence Livermore. And then I came forward in 2011. Actually, wait, let me check that. I came forward in 2009 in an appearance at a conference sponsored by James Gilliland in that ranch in Trout Lake, Washington, where they're always seeing extraterrestrial craft appearing above Mount Adams, Washington. And I'm under the aegis of Alfred Weber, and I revealed that I was a jumper at that summer's Science and Spiritual Transformation Conference, sponsored by my friend James Gilliland. And then also in 2009 time frame, Laura Eisenhower stepped forward, Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of President and Mamie Eisenhower, and testified that in 2006 and 7, her life was sort of infiltrated by a male suitor or boyfriend figure, or potential boyfriend, who gradually tried to persuade her to accept an invitation to join the American colony on the Red Planet with her 2 twin boys, Gavin and Garrick, in tow. So here, 3 members of the Eisenhower family were being invited to join the colony that apparently now exists on the Red Planet. I'd like to emphasize that Laura's invitation to join the Mars colony took place 25 years after I first went there. In fact, Laura was only 8 years old when I first jumped to Mars. Actually, she was not yet 8 years old. She was 7 years old when I first went to Mars. So we're talking about a multi-generational cover-up here. The reason I emphasize the 25 years that passed between when I first went up in July of '81 and then the invitation being extended to Laura in 2006 and 7 is, don't you think in 25 years of having the jump room and able to send people and material up every 5 to 10 minutes, that they could have equipped Mars with a much larger structure than the jump rooms that we were encountering? Of course they could have. So Laura's claim that there's a colony there, based on what she was told in the recruitment effort, is entirely consistent with the developmental timeline of such a colony. But we certainly have Laura to thank coming forward as an individual, but also as a member of a presidential family, because in American history, members of presidential dynasties or families have been very reluctant to step forward and participate in public policy discussion. I mean, some exceptions have been Amy Carter coming out against nuclear weapons and apartheid in South Africa. And I think in a similar way, Laura has really done a great public service by lending the imprimatur of her outstanding presidential name. One of our great 20th century presidents, Dwight David Eisenhower, to the truth and our right as Americans to be told it by our own government. And then William Stillings contacted me again on April 23rd of 2010, and we began to do interviews in 2010 and 11. And then as a result of those interviews featuring Brett and I, both together and separately, those were overheard by Bernard Mendez, who was kind of an older person of our training class. He was like the 30-something who was in training when the rest of us were sort of in our late teens and early 20s. He had been placed in our training program because he was being dropped, I think from Air Force Intelligence, at least he was with the Air Force at that time, into the Mars Jump Room program to ask basic questions like, why is it that some of the people being killed on the surface are then showing up at the jump room facilities on the surface of Mars and asking to be sent home? What's going on here? There were some mysteries that were occurring. And Bernie, being a seasoned extraterrestrial investigator and liaison, was being dropped as an existing professional intelligence officer into the jump room program, and that's how we met him in summer of '80, and then jumped with him. And I also have to add Randy Kramer, who came forward several years ago, claiming that beginning in 1987, when he was 17, he was stationed in the polar regions of Mars and had, among other things, hand-to-hand combat with insectivoid predators, and he journeyed via space plane. One thing that's interesting is there are some differences in Randy's account from the rest of us. For example, he never mentions us, he never mentions the jump rooms, and he talks about space planes. Now, Laura seems to have been convinced, at least initially, that, at least she thought when we had the first discussions under the aegis of Alfred Weber as the interviewer, Laura and I were discussing the fact that she had been told by the people trying to recruit her that she would go to Mars via ARC, which she presumed to be a space plane. Randy has talked about going to Mars by first going to the moon via a space plane and then jumping to Mars. Interestingly, ARC was the acronym for the jump rooms. It was shared with us during our training by Major Ed Dames that the technical term ARC for the jump rooms stood for Aeronautical Repositioning Chamber, which is basically what happened. We went into an elevator, and it morphed from a box to a cylinder, and then the door opened up, and we were on Mars. So the jump rooms were doing something like the ET craft do when they hover in the sky and they start changing shape. Okay, I think that is the technology that we reverse engineered to develop the jump rooms. In any case, Randy doesn't mention the jump rooms, and I don't know why, because presumably they're still in use. But if there's any threat to the validity of Randy's story that makes me only qualifiedly confirm its potential authenticity, it's the fact that the History Channel reported, and again, I want to be fair to Randy and not state this as his testimony, but when he appeared in the 1-hour special on his claims that the History Channel did recently this year, he was quoted as saying that his Mars experiences began and ended with abductions by men in black. My problem with that is if you go back to Albert K. Bender's book, Case File of the Men in Black, that the original book about the Men in Black, who I know exists because I had a Men in Black visit to our house in New Jersey after my father saw it, and I saw an immense ET craft above our street. And my dad, being a trained observer, said to me, that thing can't have been built by any country on this planet. Okay, we had a Men in Black visit a few days later. The Men in Black tend to visit alien contactees or people who cite ET craft and question and intimidate them. There's no history of abduction by the Men in Black along the lines of the incredibly rich literature we have about abductions and medical abductions and so forth by the gray ET species. And by the way, I use plural for that because there are dozens. there are just numerous grays. There's not one monolithic or monochromatic gray ET species. Saying that saying that a gray is a gray is like saying somebody from a certain country is a member of their region. There are numerous gray species that are visiting us. In any case, I have to qualify my belief in Randy's claims simply because that claim was made. Now, I'm going to try to ask him in person when we meet at the same conference, probably in March of this year, in Tacoma, Washington, under the sponsorship of Jane Cameron and Scott Mowry, whether that's Randy's claim that his experiences began and ended with involvement in terms of abduction by Men in Black. I just don't think there's support for that at all in ufology. William Whitecrow also tends to disbelieve Randy's account. But again, because my goal was, here's William Whitecrow, because my goal was to bring other experiencers forward, I don't want to play the role of cynic or censor of somebody else's claims. A couple of things that diverge from Randy Kramer's experiences and the experiences of the rest of us is that he was in the polar regions and we were always jumping to the equatorial regions. So if he encountered other life forms, the difference in region of Mars may explain it. Since he was career military, or claims he was career military, what he was doing, like fighting predators all day long, may naturally differ from what we experienced as civilian jumpers, who are pretty much up there just to sort of reconnoiter the terrain as natural scientists. Okay, so I'm holding a place open for Randy to learn more about what happened to him and have face-to-face discussions with him to see if I will ultimately believe or disbelieve his account. He has extended the dialogue to include new material that the jumpers could not provide. So who are we to say that he didn't do what we did? I think that's kind of arrogant. So I'm going to meet with Randy at some point and then publish my opinion as to the authenticity of his claims. And then William Whitecrow, last summer, I was with a friend in Redding, California. He had been trying for several years to introduce me to his friend Whitecrow, and I had no idea that the person he was talking about was the guy, Bill, who had taught me martial arts when I was a child in Project Pegasus, and who was a guard that I had met on the surface of Mars. But he took me out to his prepper compound outside Redding. And I said, you're the guy that I met on Mars. We had the firefight with the pterodactyls. And before that, you taught me martial arts. And he said, I was sitting here all along waiting for you to figure it out. So William Whitecrow was using a different surname, his given surname, when he was my martial arts instructor when I was in the 5th grade in 71, 72. But as we'll see later in the talk, he actually endorsed me for president, affirming that he had played those 2 roles in my life, and I'm eternally grateful for the great William Whitecrow to have come forward as one of the Army guards on Mars, guarding the lives of the jumpers. Let me go back to William, because he's a remarkable person I want to share with you. William Whitecrow is of an Anglo background, but was raised on a Native American reservation in California. And one of the strange things that happened when he was a child is he hitchhiked all the way from Los Angeles County to Weed, California, where the jump room training would ultimately be, like when he was 8 years old or something. He is a remarkable person in terms of his own development of his body. When he was in the Mars jump room program, and even before that, back in the early 70s, when he was teaching me this mix of karate and aikido, he had the most developed masculine form of anybody you could meet, and that was before steroids. So, he had like an Arnold Schwarzenegger physique with cannonball biceps before the advent of steroids, which meant he had a lot of willpower to do all that weight training. He was also a consummate educator in using your mind to avoid danger. As he later explained in a radio interview that we did together, he was basically teaching us mental control. So they had to kind of inculcate that in the minds of time travelers and off-planet visitors and so forth. Because if you panic and go sideways when you're in those situations, you could very well die. So I also thank William Whitecrow for optimizing my human potential, because in the 5th grade, I had the privilege of studying him, with him being my, what is it called in martial arts, like my sende or whatever, in the sense that he inculcated me in the set of skills that I used to maximize my human potential. And I'm eternally grateful to William for that. I'm also grateful that as career military with a pension to protect, he has come forward and embraced the truth movement and is doing numerous interviews now about his time travel and Mars experiences. So I think to date, he's the strongest corroborated witness that I have. And he's a man of steel and a great guy. So let's take a break, and when we come back, I'll do kind of more of an up close with the three jumpers that have come forward to corroborate my initial account, and we'll see that there are 4 people who knew each other in the project who have now come forward among the 8 or 9 whistleblowers that we now have. And essentially the story has been proven publicly as far as I'm concerned. So I no longer feel a compulsion to have to prove our claims. I think they've been proven, and we've done so publicly and in the court of public opinion. So let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back and take a look at William Stillings, Bernard Mendez, and William Whitecrow more closely. Okay, in this section, I'm going to take a closer look at the 3 jumpers who stepped forward as whistleblowers to corroborate my account after 2009. And just to show the kind of factual verification that immediately proved to all of us that we had had a shared set of experiences, that while they may have been blocked by Ed Dames using the reverse engineered American version of the Soviet LIDA machine, that's capital L-I-D-A, which is an electromagnetic device that blocks your memories. It doesn't erase them, it simply blocks them. That 30 years after, not that mind control, but that memory blocking was put in place, we worked with each other to go around those memory blocks so that, let's say, the 100 or more Skype conversations I've done with these gentlemen, we've gone back and captured most of what happened to us individually and as a group. Not all of it, but a whole heck of a lot of what happened to us. So let's take a look at some of these factual correspondences. First, Brett Stillings came forward, and then Bernard Mendez, and then William Whitecrow. So let's look at what Brett and I first agreed on. Brett and I were able to identify these 10 people as participants in the Jump Room program. We've now identified about 20 people, but I haven't even listed them yet. But so that, in addition to Major Dames, there was myself, Regina Dugan, Willie McCool, Barry Satoro / Barry Obama, Brett himself, my father Raymond, Barry's mother Stanley Ann, Brett's father Thomas, and Bernard Mendez. And we remembered specific things about them and our interaction with them. Obviously, we knew our own fathers, but we were able to agree that these 10 people were in the program. Brett also quoted verbatim something that Ed Dames had said when he was discussing the survivability issues, which was, I believe it was untrue. But in one of his lectures to us, he had stated, of the 97,000 people that we have thus far sent to Mars, only 7,000 have survived after 5 years. We think he may have been referring to the settlers, but then again, William Whitecrow states that he thinks about 1,500 people were on the surface at the same time, or during the same time period. When he was discussing how we were going to play the role of acclimating Martian humanoids and animals to our presence as Earthlings, we both remember that Ed Dames had said, when he was always joking, he would end each segment of his lectures with a joke. He said, simply put, your task is to be seen and not eaten. And then there was also the colloquy between Brett and I on the surface, in which we were at a stone picnic table-like structure with Courtney Hunt. And Brett was engrossed in our conversation and not looking around. I'm not even sure he received the same training to do this as I was, because I, of course, was a guard in the sense that I had the photo flash gun tucked in my belt, and Brett didn't. So I said, Brett, were you given any training? And he said, what? And I said, 3 minutes have passed and you haven't looked around. So I was obviously trained to be hyper-vigilant on the surface. And with Brett and some of the more relaxed personalities, I was quite a contrast to that. I'll show you one rather prominent jumper who never looked around. He never acted like he was on Mars. In fact, he always acted like he was somewhere in Texas. And I'll show you who that was in a second. And then Brent remembered that when we were in the jump room device on Mars, in order to signal the control system that we were in a certain floor of the jump room column, we would press that button, where on Earth, if you did that in an elevator, it causes the door to open up. In the jump room elevators on Mars, it caused the process of returning to Earth to begin. We would press the button of the floor that we were on, and we would hear an intercom from the ceiling, "Are you ready to return?" And then we were trained to tilt our heads back in a 90-degree angle to the ceiling and say in a loud, clear voice, "Ready to return." So we agreed on the departure protocol for Mars. In the case of Bernie Mendez, we remembered a night run where Bernie picked me up at the UCLA dorms. In fact, I memorized the fact that this was 3/3/83. March 3rd of 1983, we went on the so-called night run. And then when Bernie came over to the dorms and greeted me, he was wearing a green army-type sweater over his backpack. And I had kidded him that you look like a turtle, and I asked him why he wasn't just wearing his backpack outside his sweater. So we both remember that after 30 years. So I think we have to be careful what we say to others, because sometimes they might take it the wrong way, but I was really just an innocent comment, and yet Bernie and I remembered it after 30 years. Now we did the night run with Regina Dugan, and here it says, and another woman. It was actually 2 other women. We've identified one of those 2 women as Laura's aunt, Mary Jean Eisenhower, the granddaughter of President and Mamie Eisenhower. So there again is another Eisenhower family connection to the project. And we remembered that before the night run, the 4 of us, it was actually the 5 of us. It was myself, Bernard Mendez, Mary Jean Eisenhower, Regina Dugan, and a 3rd female. We stayed at a kind of a military dormitory near the El Segundo jump room site. We remember that during the night run, we were chased around in front of the jump room facility, which was the corkscrew, was the one that was kind of conch shaped, and by small 4-footed dinosaur-like creatures. And the bizarre thing that was happening was beneath each of our footfalls in the dirt would illuminate as if the dirt was a thin layer over some illuminated panels. And that was one holographic effect that made absolutely no sense. We remember that after the night run, Regina Dugan and I were debriefed by Major Dames and Bernard Mendez in the debriefing room at the sub-basement level of the El Segundo jump room site, or jump room facility. And it was resolved that my right arm, which had been torn off during the attack, literally bitten off by one of these dinosaur-like predators, was back on my body. So that's another holographic effect of the night run that still hasn't been explained. It was torn off, hanging by shreds, what was left of my ligaments and tendons and bone coming from my shoulder. And yet, when Regina and I sat in front of Ed Dames on our right and Bernard standing on the left, Bernard had me, without looking, reach over and touch my right arm and confirm to myself that my arm was still attached to my shoulder. But back on Mars, like when we ran to the jump room to come home, it was gone. I had lost my arm. So that has no explanation. That, in fact, was in the area of why Bernard Mendez was involved, to explain and find a rationale or an explanation for why these effects were occurring, where something would happen on the surface, but it would be corrected so that a person who had been eaten alive would show up at the jump room facility on Mars asking to come home. I would get my right arm torn off in an attack and then fight it back on my arm by the time I was debriefed in El Segundo. I'm not sure that was ever explained. And then Bernard remembered the next day how we went up and he asked to the same location, and he asked me to project thoughts of love and peace and acceptance at the small dinosaurs. And without chasing us, they allowed us to go over and stand before them and pat them on the heads and kind of pet them like, peaceable creatures on Earth are petted on the head. And they began mewing sort of in whale-like sounds, kind of like this. So that's seemed to be what we're being taught in that activity. If there was either gray or Martian intervention, what we were seemingly being taught as Earthlings visiting Mars, among the first to visit Mars, was that whatever we presumed the universe would hold, it would project back to us. If we projected fear and violence, it would treat us fearsomely and violently. And if we projected peace and nonviolence and confidence, it would project peace and nonviolence and acceptance and so forth back at us. So in the discussions after that night run followed by the day visit the next day, Bernard and Courtney Hunt and I and others figured out that that's what we were being taught is be careful about what you project into the cosmos, because the cosmos will mirror back what you're projecting at it. Now in the case of White Crow, he remembered that he first met me when I was still with DARPA, time traveling in 1971-72. He corroborated that. My 5th grade year was when he taught me a mix of karate and aikido as my sensei or martial arts teacher. He remembers that we met up on Mars about 11 or 12 years later, 1982-83 time frame. He was standing by a Quonset hut when Stillings and I arrived, walked out of a jump room and walked over to his location. That the Quonset hut, as I remembered, was covered with camouflage netting, and that White Crow was standing there as an army guard. I didn't recognize him, by the way, as my martial arts instructor. I only figured that out in 2015, meeting him in Redding, California, when I was now 54 and he was 62 years of age. So half a lifetime later, I put 1 and 2 together and figured out that the very person who had been my martial arts instructor at Pegasus was that Army guard I met on the surface. Now, when I was returning from Ed's prepper compound outside Redding back to the home of our mutual friend Ed Shiraki, who was trying to throw us together for several years with no knowledge that we had a direct personal connection. In fact, too, in terms of serving in both Pegasus and Mars, as only 2 others we've been able to identify did, namely my father and Ed Dames. I remembered, and then later corroborated with White Crow, that when Brett, excuse me, that when William Stones and I went over to his location, he had described that several jumpers had been attacked the previous day by some pterodactyl-like predators. And he asked us if he wanted to go over there. We entered a kind of a troop carrier that he was driving and went over there. And we then had about 20 pterodactyls circling above us. They began dive bombing our position, trying to bite us and kill us and eat us. White Crow had only 2 automatic weapons. I was older than Brett and had been cleared for firearm use. And so he threw me the other automatic weapon and instructed Brett to kind of get close to the ground to avoid being bit because Brett didn't have a weapon. And we then were involved in a 30-minute firefight where he yelled to me, get a line on them at 15, get ready to 15 feet, get ready to fire at 10 feet, and fire like hell at 5 feet. And so we then went back to back, and we were firing these automatic weapons up at the pterodactyls and killing them like right when they were upon us, sometimes actually having to shoot one while we were batting another one out of the way with our hand and then turning and shooting it. So I credit White Crow with saving my life in that context. And he also corroborated, by the way, that he remembers that the pterodactyls smelled very musty, kind of like a musty attic, as we were shooting them down so that they wouldn't bite us and try to eat us. He remembered, as I did in the rest of the 1980s, in the second half of the 1980s, he was on 2 timelines and had different quantum discrepancies, apparently as a result of his involvement in the jump room program. In my case, I split into 2 timelines where I attended law school at least part of the time, a part of my studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder, beginning in 1985, in other words, enrolling in fall of '85, as later corroborated by a CIA agent that I met in the Loreto Chapel in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but then did a full course of studies beginning in 1988 at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. So apparently our involvement in the jump room program split some of us so that during the remainder of the 1980s, we were operating on two different timelines. He would then publish an endorsement of my presidential candidacy on April 29th of 2016, in which he remembered and stated being my martial arts instructor when I was time traveling for DARPA and then guarding my life on Mars. So William Whitecrow has extended the full measure of personal decency and friendship to me, and I couldn't be happier to have made his acquaintance again. Okay, my three proudest moments on the surface. This area I do a little bragging. There was an incident in which I told William Stillings not to go around a big boulder because I was using my psychic ability to remotely view the fact that there was one of the insectivoid predators lurking there. This particular predator looked like, I don't really know how to describe it, looked like a cross between a grasshopper and a small garbage truck. It had so many extensions and was so big. It was like, you know, it was like 12 feet wide and 9 feet high, and looked like a huge grasshopper with samurai swords as front teeth. So I said, Brett, you better not go around that rock. Let's get out of here. And he went around it at about 30 feet. And I was about 60 feet behind the predator, 30 feet behind Brett, about 60 feet from the predator. And I said, Brett, on the count of 3, let's run like hell and let's see if we can beat this thing. Because in our training, this was the second type of predator that we were told would be inevitably lethal. So at that point, looking on at Brett being that close, I thought, oh great, I'm going to see Brett eaten alive here. Just as I had seen 2 others eaten alive by the dinosaur-like predator. And yet we did outrun it. So it must have just eaten or something and was logy and didn't catch up to us. So fortunately, we did run like hell and outrun it. The second thing I'm proud about is really deserving of a full telling of what happened. I was in the jump room from El Segundo with Bernard Mendez, and as we neared the surface of Mars, it began fragmenting, almost like we see images of a US spacecraft beginning to heat up as it enters the Earth's atmosphere. It began fragmenting and broke up just as we were touching the surface. So Bernard and I were rolled across a rocky sort of earthen surface area, mostly a dusty, patch of dirt rather than a rocky surface. But there were rocks in it, but it was mostly just dirt. And kind of like dice on a Las Vegas casino table. And I had a stress reaction in which I was sort of pulling it. I was sitting like Matt Damon in Saving Private Ryan and kind of pulling my hair out, not so much because I was afraid, but because I was angry that the CIA had finally gotten me killed. I only joined the project grudgingly. When we were given the chance, during a short period into our training, to get up and leave the program forever, I almost did. But I think peer pressure and the fact that I would let my dad down prevented me from doing that. But I was angry at the CIA because anytime I would ask somebody connected to CIA, like let's say Courtney Hunt, about something, I would sometimes get either an oblique answer, a hardly comprehensible answer, or no answer. I had even said to Courtney Hunt one time, Courtney, do you know how you're like an ET? And he said, why? Why would you ask that? I said, because you don't answer unwelcome questions. You just stare at me. And CIA is asking me to go to another planet. I can't get my questions answered. What's the big deal? Okay, so when Bernie and I were sort of stranded with it because our jump room broke up and we were rolled across the surface, I was sitting there pulling my hair out and probably swearing, but I was definitely in a kind of a reaction to the stress element of our experiences, just as the time when Barry was too afraid to get out of the jump room, or Brett got on the surface one time and was kind of babbling. We all had our moments where
the enormity of what we were being asked to do, the psychological pressure of it, simply overwhelmed our normal function. There's no shame in that. It's a normal human reaction. And so Bernard Mendez came over and grabbed me by the lapels and said, Andy, get a hold of yourself. I know where we are. I'm going to get us out of here. Follow me. And I did. I kind of calmed down and I followed him. We walked around a mountain range and could see the jump room facility called the Corkscrew on the horizon. But we were about maybe 1.5 miles from it. I thought, oh, this is going to be a great walk. It was always difficult to walk on the surface because the oxygen is very thin. So imagine being at, being in an atmosphere that has like the oxygen content of what it is on Earth when you're, 14,000 feet up above sea level on Mount Everest. But instead of climbing a mountain, you're being asked to walk a great distance. I thought, geez, am I going to be totally winded when I get there or what? So as we were walking there, we were still about 1 mile from the jump room facility. Bernard Mendez, who was walking in front of me, fainted. He basically went into unconsciousness on his feet and hit the ground so hard that his feet and legs kind of bucksawed up behind him. And I thought, great, I can leave him here and he's going to be eaten. Or I could either drag him or carry him home. So what I did is I put Bernard over my right shoulder. He was 160 pounds. I was 180 in those years. And I fired and carried him to the jump room, putting him on the ground twice and then picking him up again and doing the fireman's carry. And I ultimately kind of slowly crept into the jump room facility, practically falling over myself, and dropped him in the jump room, the elevator. And I said to the technician, I don't know whether he's alive. He was still breathing out in the field. Get him home. And then Bernard woke up in a Los Angeles hospital, probably Daniel Freeman Memorial Hospital near Marina del Rey, which was the closest hospital to the El Segundo jump room site. That may have been the incident in which I had a heart attack, because my doctors have told me that even though I've never had any symptoms of a heart attack, angina pain, or shooting pains into the arms, shooting pains into the neck, or lockjaw, and I don't have that characteristic crease on my ears that heart attack patients have, there is a focal point in my EKG readout that indicates that at some time in my life I had a heart attack. And that's one of the reasons why I was grounded for this flight, because if I had a heart attack or if I had pulmonary edema from the condition that my heart's in, that I couldn't be helped if I was at 33,000 feet. So until we clear up what cardiac pulmonary functioning, I'm going to be grounded. But anyway, that was a real shock to me recently when I learned that. And I think it may have been carrying Bernard in from the field that I had what's called a silent heart attack, because it was extremely difficult to carry a 160 pounds person about 1 mile with the kind of oxygen supply you'd have at 14,000 feet. It was almost physically impossible. And then the third thing I'm proud about is the firefight with the pterodactyls, with Williams, White Crow, and Stillings, which saved the lives of all 3 of us. That was really cool. Even though the animals had to die, we had no choice because they were trying to kill and eat us. So, all's fair in the law of the jungle. Okay, so here are 5 other Mars Jumper program participants that, in addition to Barry Obama, Regina Dugan, and I hope to someday count myself in the same category, whether I win the presidency or not, I hope to make this as estimable a contribution to civilization as those 2 have. But here are some other interesting people who we have confirmed were project participants. First, Bernard Mendez confirmed that President Richard Nixon, during his retirement after resigning the presidency in disgrace in August of 1974, was still so well regarded as a brainy individual and a talented intelligence analyst, that the CIA was using Nixon in retirement in San Clemente, California, as the primary defense or intelligence analyst on the CIA's Mars Jump Room program, which is almost unbelievable, but Bernard insists that's the case. The other individual that I know I met was Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes Howard Hughes supposedly died in the 1974-75 period as this wasted shadow of his former self, kind of a derelict human being with long hair and fingernails and covering everything with tissues because he was afraid of germs, and saving his urine in mason jars and eating black walnut ice cream while watching Ice Station Zebra over and over again. That was a cover story, because at the El Segundo jump room site, at one of the floors, I think it was probably the floor beneath the jump room floor, floor 7, there were a suite of offices, and a couple times I went down with somebody else who was higher up in the hierarchy of the program. And there was a man sitting behind a big table who was basically an elderly Howard Hughes, but not the decrepit, disheveled vision of Howard Hughes that we were told about. And clearly, a Howard Hughes who was still alive in the first half of the 1980s. We now know that Howard Hughes did live to 2001 under an assumed name, and that his death and his condition at his death in the mid-70s was a cover story to hide his ongoing involvement in defense technical projects like the jump room program. But I remember going into Mr. Hughes' office, and he was sort of smiling, not that stern, serious Howard Hughes that's always depicted like in this picture. He was smiling almost kind of like in a giddy way. He almost looked like a little bookie behind his desk. And he said, "Oh, is this Andy? Oh, this is Andy. Hi, Andy. Howard Hughes." Okay, so another aspect here is that the government frequently claims that different personnel died so that I guess they're not subject to kidnapping or assassination. And one of those individuals was the air pioneer, Howard Hughes, whose very company, Hughes Aircraft, owned and operated that building at 999 North Sepulveda that the West Coast jump room was in. So somebody else connected to the project in some capacity, probably a technical capacity, was Howard Hughes, because he literally had an office, not necessarily at the El Segundo headquarters of Hughes Aircraft, but at 999 North Sepulveda. Another connection between Howard Hughes and the jump room program in my own experience is that one of my law clients in Vancouver, Washington, I will give her name as Rose M, because I don't have her permission to reveal this, told me when I was representing her, and I was sharing some of my defense project experiences with her, that she had been a secretary to Howard Robart Hughes at the Hughes Aircraft El Segundo headquarters buildings for Hughes. And that one day he came to her and said, "Rose, some men from another planet are going to be stopping at your desk today and giving you some parts. Please just take the parts from them and thank them for providing them to me." So they could have been literally Martians, because, you know, the jump room process involved two planetary civilizations. And so I think Hughes was involved technically in the liaison with the Martians, and that would explain why he was still on the project when it was operational. But Howard Hughes was still alive when we were jumping between 1981 and 84, and he was literally on the project. Then, and by the way, that was confirmed by Whitecrow. Nixon's involvement was confirmed by Mendez, but Howard Hughes and that office near the jump room floor of the building was corroborated by William Whitecrow, who then commented, "Man, you really have a good memory." Maybe it was Whitecrow that I'd gone down to Hughes' office with. I don't remember who it was who introduced me to Mr. Hughes. It may have been Mendez. In any case, another instance, Mendez and I went up to the surface, accessed one of the lesser used jump rooms. It was almost like a public laboratory sitting in a kind of a high desert of California kind of foliage, because there are some areas of Mars that are vegetated. And a man came out of the jump room about 15 minutes after us, who I thought was Peter Byrne, the legendary Bigfoot researcher, because he was wearing a pith helmet, a cravat, a tan shirt, tan shorts, tan socks, and tan shoes. So he looked like, you know, the great white explorer, as it were. But it wasn't. He came over and introduced himself to Bernard Mendez and I and said, "Hi, Stan Turner." And that was this gentleman, Admiral Stansfield Turner, who was the director of Central Intelligence during the Carter administration, and was, again, a Navy officer, and an Annapolis graduate. Surprise, surprise. Now, Stan Turner went to Annapolis around the time that this individual went to Annapolis, H. Ross Perot, the Texas industrialist. When I was jumping, there was a Texan who was so talkative and such a voluble personality, really so entertaining in his folksy, kind of humorous personality, that he never looked around for predators. He used to agitate me. I met him 2 or 3 times. So meeting this guy, I never had his name. If I did, I forgot it. His name was given to me as Ross, I forgot it. But he would just jabber away in these amusing, kind of didactic, autobiographical discussions where he was like imparting information, wisdom, and his own personality at the same time. And then I learned through a friend of Lindsay's, who is the granddaughter by marriage of H. Ross Perot, that when they brought me or my story to Ross, he said, "Oh, I know Andy." And we now believe that, and there's some evidence in the family, that H. Ross Perot was that talkative Texan that I met several times on the surface. Now, this means that in addition to Barack Obama and I, an individual who sought the presidency, namely H. Ross Perot, ran for president on the Reform Party ticket in 1992, and the votes that he took away from George H.W. Bush among conservatives actually gave the presidency to Bill Clinton. But I'm fairly certain it was Ross, and yet I met him at a much younger age than he ran for president. I mean, Ross was born in 1940, so I met him when he was in his early 40s, and then the country got to know him when he was in his early 50s. And believe me, as somebody who's now 55, we do a lot of aging between 40 and 50, or between 40 and 55. So I think that we can also count H. Ross Perot among the jumpers. Certainly the Annapolis Naval Academy connection and the naval officer connection is consistent. William Stillings and I were told that we became lieutenants in the United States Navy as a result of our first jump to Mars. And I was told by Courtney Hunt and by Dr. Eldon Andrew Bird before their deaths, that after getting my doctoral degree, which is my Juris Doctor, I had graduated up to the level of Lieutenant Commander with the United States Navy. So imagine the violation of the law and the Constitution involving young people and young adults, basically children and young adults, in secret defense projects, not paying them, not benefiting them, and hence violating the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery and involuntary servitude, and then listing them secretly as naval officers. That apparently has been done in my case, and there are multiple points that establish that. So some of the guys going up and women were, military officers, and some of us were being shadow listed as, for example, naval officers, but we weren't paid and we weren't benefited. And in addition to being a human rights and a constitutional violation, that violates basic fairness and equity. So that's one of the reasons I'm speaking out, is to get financial redress for the jumpers and the time travelers who were not paid and not benefited. Another individual that was a participant in the night run I mentioned was Laura's aunt, Mary Jean Eisenhower, and evincing the same leadership potential in the sense that after her jump room days, she would go on to become the president of the People-to-People Ambassadors Program that President Eisenhower founded as a vehicle for second-level diplomacy. So I'm sure it was Mary Jean, and there she is. In fact, I asked her, when she gave me her name, at the dormitory that we went to before going over to the jump room site at night, "Are you a descendant of the President Eisenhower?" And she said, "Yep, the one and only." So it was, in fact, Mary Jean Eisenhower. And I remember her giving me that as her name. Okay, now there's been a dispute between William Stillings and Bernard Mendez and I about the 3 possible destinations in time-space that the jump room was taking us to. Brett believes we were going to the real planet Mars in real time. And he cites the fact that we could see the Martian moons Phobos and Deimos in the sky. They were in their right locations at proper trajectories. He remembers that Courtney Hunt told he and I in front of the corkscrew that the Viking 2 apparatus was about 20 miles in a particular direction. Brett and I remember going over there and seeing the Viking 2 apparatus. They've now turned it into kind of a museum exhibit or shrine. Brett states that NASA cannot be relied to provide accurate data because it has a history of lying to us about the natural conditions and constraints on Mars, the climatological factors or meteorological factors. And he also constructed a brilliant proof around the idea that since Mars' atmosphere is only 8 millibars compared to 1,000 millibars on Earth, how is it that if that's the case, the parachutes of the rover's Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity could have worked on Mars? If Mars has an atmospheric pressure of only 8 millibars, Brett estimated that the size of the parachutes that brought those rovers down on Mars, such as this one attached to Curiosity, would have had to have been the size not of what we see here, but of the continental United States. The cynics have responded that, well, that's true given the low pressure on Mars, but they used rockets to inflate and keep inflated the parachutes, which I just think, I'm sorry, it's a specious argument. So I think Brett has made a very valid point here. Bernie thinks we weren't visiting the real Mars at all. He believes we were visiting what he calls, or what we together named, a synthetic quantum environment, or SQE Mars, which would be in the form of an artificial holographic planetary domain that would constitute hidden land in sort of quantum pockets, or previously unexplored pockets of the cosmos, or the time-space continuum. He cites the fact that Mars was out of position when we were going there, that the Mars atmosphere was deficient in oxygen to sustain human life. And I asked Courtney Hunt about that, and he said that there was oxygen in the atmosphere of Mars because it was leaching out of the lithosphere, the rocks on Mars. Bernard stated the gravity on the surface was stronger than it would have been on Mars, which was true, but wouldn't be true if either Earth and or Mars, or both, were hollow. Then you wouldn't have the 1 over 2.5 differential that we should have expected on Mars. In other words, if the Mars we were going to was a solid Mars being compared to a solid Earth, and neither Earth nor Mars are primarily solid, primarily hollow, but are solid, then our stride of a normal 3 feet for an adult male Earthling should have allowed us to leap 7.5 feet on Mars, given the 1 over 2.5 differential. But in fact, we were only able to leap stride about 4 feet rather than 3 when we were on Mars. So the displacement relative to gravity was off, and Bernard was accurate in citing that. I just don't know what it means. Then he cites the fact that this conventional science data states that Mars has a nighttime temperature of 175 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and noontime temperatures of plus 225 degrees Fahrenheit, and hence would not have been survivable by creatures like us who are 60% water and the rest are kind of a gelatinous protoplasm that makes up our bodies outside of our skeletons and so forth. Okay, so he just says that the temperatures on the real Mars are too hostile for unprotected human life to survive. He said the lack of an ionosphere on Mars would have irradiated us, and hence that all these prove what he ended up proving or learning or showing when he was on the project, which is that we were visiting some kind of SQE that the technology to access that SQE had been given to us by one of the gray extraterrestrial species, and the program was deceiving us that we were going to Mars. We were actually exploring some form of hidden land recessed within these SQEs, new land to explore, but within these pockets of time space. He even stated that Ed Dames revealed to him before the project concluded that we were not accessing the real Mars, but an SQE that sort of mimicked the real Mars in some ways. I think that both of those models could be accurate, which is to say that we could have been going in a synthetic way to the real Mars. So, for example, it could have been Mars in real time that we were visiting via some kind of exoplanetary holography. After all, when the jumpers have been saying that we teleported to Mars, we weren't teleporting in any way that I teleported in Project Pegasus. In fact, there was no evidence we were teleporting. We were standing in an elevator that was morphing from a box into a cylinder, and then the elevator was opening. There was no sense of forward momentum or travel besides the wormholing that was swirling on the far side of the jumper. So I think they may have found a way to extrude the holography produced by Chronovision off planet, and that's what we were doing. We were visiting the real Mars, but in a hologram of it. And that would also give some better physical explanation for the sort of bizarre properties of the jump rooms themselves. The fact that we could walk into an elevator and walk out on another planet. We may have actually been walking into a hologram of another planet. So, my evidence is that we were trained from Mars and told that we were visiting it. The origin and function of the jump rooms remains unknown. Was it Lockheed, Skunk Works, and Parsons? Was it one of the gray typologies, or was it both that had led to the development of the jump rooms? We don't know. I said that there's some evidence that we were visiting the real Mars in the sense that when we first started jumping in 1981, Mars was, in its 2-year cycle, was distant from Earth. It took 20 minutes. But then as Mars neared Earth, by spring of 1984, the distance to Mars was such that the time in the jump room only took 8 minutes, which is why my father, with his cardiac and pulmonary problems medically, was approved to jump in 1984. That was my last jump in May of '84. And then also the night run with Mendez, Dugan, and Eisenhower, and myself, and the other woman in the program whose name we don't have, who was on that jump room, was clear evidence that we were in a hologram and not visiting directly the planet Mars. Okay, now there's additional evidence that we were visiting the real Mars, however, that has been brought forward by our great organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, and I number these. We have found in the last 7 years of anomaly research with our 200+ contributors, all of whom I'm very proud of and very grateful to, the following traits about the real Mars that we've been analyzing based on NASA's own photographs from its rovers. We've been finding that Mars is a desert planet, that it's inhabited, that it's sparsely populated despite being inhabited, that there are water deposits above and below the surface, that Mars has blue skies that I have likened to pale blue, sort of baby blue skies, like a baby boy's blanket, blue blanket, that there are humanoids there are plesiosaurs, there are dinosaur-like reptiles, there are hybrids between known and unknown Earth species, certainly hybrids between known Earth species like the man grub or the scorpion man that I met and then found. I found the scorpion man in NASA image PIA 10214, and, without jumping ahead too fast, and the fact that there's faces that litter the surface of Mars, both large and small, everything from small intaglios of faces and heads that have been carved into rock or metal, such as Ross Curley's great find of the face of a pharaoh on a rock on Mars, all the way to these massive faces like the face on Mars at Cydonia, or the 8 faces that I found in the rural vallis of Mars in July of 2009 in a picture taken by the ESA from satellite. There are skulls on the surface. We photographed them. I mean, we've found them in NASA's data, and they exist in the narratives of the Mars jumpers, how the Martians used skulls on the surface to indicate access points to the Martian underground, just like we would put a plastic dome over a public phone booth, and that they use statues as signage. This is something that I want to impart to those who have joined us or who will view this video or one version of today's talks or this weekend's talks. A major aspect that I've been trying to emphasize over and over again, and it really hasn't sunk in, and it's really not generally understood by those who are actively doing Mars anomaly work, that a lot of the scary and alternatively cartoonish images on Mars are a function of the fact that the Martians used statues as signage, particularly to indicate whether a certain area of the surface is hostile or benign to human life in light of these predator threats. So ask yourself when you're examining something that doesn't really seem to make any sense, why would they put this here? Ask yourself whether what's depicted in the structure or the artifact or the painting or the carving, could it be a form of signage that indicates to those who will come later whether there is a threat or no threat potential in that particular local area of Mars? Because they do this extensively. In fact, they even do it where they'll make 3 structures or 3 artworks so that when you look at all 3 of them and your eye hits 1, 2, 3, as you go farther in distance, and the signage, the statues tend to kind of complement each other and create a unique image with the overlay of the 3 statues, for example. Sometimes you'll see what they're trying to show you. So they even use statues as signage when they're using a line of sight approach to stack up statues so that what you ultimately end up seeing as an intelligent humanoid is what they're trying to show you in that location. So this cannot be underemphasized. It's a lot of what the artwork on Mars actually is. Are warnings or non-warnings, encouragements that a certain area is either perilous, that you might be eaten if you linger there, or that it's for the most part entirely safe. Okay, now, in light of this, despite all this information coming forward, in light of the yeoman work of the men and women of the Mars Anomaly Research Society, in light of the fact that I'm 45 days older, unless I leave this earthly station in life sooner rather than later, I'm going to be around for a long time, and I'm going to be writing a memoir about my Mars experiences. Despite that fact, that despite his own heroic service, President Obama, as president, has decided to deny everything that I've presented thus far. The fact that Mars is inhabited, the fact that American astronauts have been visiting it since no later than 1964, the existence of the junk room program, and his direct participation in it. Now, let's explore what those 3 presidential disinformation ploys have been. When William Stillings and Laura Eisenhower and I appeared on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie on 11/10/11, a month and a half later, on January 3rd or 4th of 2012, President Obama, through the spokesman for his National Security Council, a man by the name of Tommy Beador, planted an article in Wired.com in which, among other things, the following was alleged. Actually, it was January 4th of 2012. Officially, the White House says Obama never went to Mars. And then he's quoted, or Tommy Beador rather is quoted, only if you count watching Marvin the Martian. Tommy Beador, the spokesman for the National Security Council, told Danger Room of Wired.com. But that's exactly what a secret chrononaut wants you to believe. Now, I'd just like to pause for a moment so we can ponder the abject cynicism of this article. I served with Barack Obama, and like he and everybody else who went, young and old, male and female, American, Russian, British, whatever, we all served with honor and bravery because it was a difficult thing to leave the planet, our beautiful blue ball, our beautiful blue marble, Mother Earth, and go to a hot, dry, scary desert planet. A very accurate description of which was given to us by Paul Goodwin, again, of the United Kingdom, when he said that Mars is the Halloween planet. It's a scary, bizarre place. It's in a sense some of the inspiration for our nightmares, for our imagined ghouls and goblins of Halloween time. And I served with Barry. We were on good terms. We both liked and admired each other. We had one falling out when we were rooming together because we had a policy disagreement that I don't need to go into, a political issue. But, you know, when Barry left from the Finlandia motel there, he ran down the stairs and ran across the parking lot and shook my hand and gave me a half abrazo, you know, a half hug, and said, "It's been great being in the program with you, man. I hope we can meet up again when we're on Mars." And we did. We met up in Los Angeles. We met up at the El Segundo jump room site. We met up in the jump room, and a number of times we met up on the surface. One time, I was sitting on the retaining wall of one of the jump room facilities, and I watched Barry, you know, the thoughtful, tall young man that he was, walk in from the horizon. And when he went past me, I kind of just smiled at him like, have we been screwed, blued, or tattooed for being in this program or what? I was practically laughing, trying to get a response out of him. And he looked at me and he said, "Well, now we're here." You know, so Barry and I had a connection when we were on the project. He's a good guy. I've been distressed by the amount of negative treatment Barack Obama's gotten as president, because the Barack Obama I knew was an intelligent, thoughtful, funny, persevering, excellent young person. I'm not sure about all these rumors that have been spread about him, that his wife is a man, that he's gay, that he's a druggie. I don't really believe any of that because, as I've said, the Barack Obama that I knew and worked with, of all the 2,000 or more people I probably met, same age peers I met during my 4 years at UCLA, Barry was I would definitely put him at the top of the list for people that I would trust with the responsibility of the presidency. He was an excellent person. He was a very likable and kind and friendly person. So I'm distressed when I hear those criticisms. But I have to challenge him on this point. I mean, the National Security Council consists of the President, the Vice President, the Secretaries of State and Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Assistant National Security Advisor, and their spokesperson. So this means that whether or not to knock down my story with a veiled presidential denial was worthy of doing or not was actually vetted by the National Security Council, when they should have been worrying about maintaining peace with other powerful military nations and still not having a rights violated as a country or as individuals. They were meeting and discussing my claims and those of Laura and Brett on Coast to Coast AM in November of 2011. And I'm particularly angry that he mocked my service as one of the pioneers of time travel in Project Pegasus when he says, "But that's exactly what a secret chrononaut wants you to believe." When was the last time, or even the first time for that reason, that the White House, on behalf of the president, saw fit of the necessity to knock down a story that somebody was claiming about the president's background that could be readily dismissed not only as, basically at that point, as unsubstantiated gossip, but as also an urban legend or a conspiracy theory? In other words, if my story was not true, why did the White House deny it? And isn't this denial what we would call in the law a tacit admission? Yes, it was. It was not a highly sophisticated level of statecraft in the sense it was a statement that never should have been made, because it really revealed that we were telling the truth, and the president was committed to a cover-up of those truths, and the fact that he was served in the jump room program. Now, the second statement was made when the rover Curiosity was launched in August of 2012. In the Los Angeles Times edition of August 13th, 2012, President Obama was quoted as making the following statement about the launching of the Mars exploration rover Curiosity. He said, "If, in fact, you do make contact with Martians, please let me know right away. I've got a lot of other things on my plate, but I suspect that that would go to the top of the list, even if they are just microbes." Now, this statement was released by Barack Obama, who not only attended Ed Dame's seminar on Martian life forms and knew that some of them included humanoids and advanced land animals, including predators, but who encountered humanoids and Martians on the surface. So this goes to the depth of deception that caused me to come forward and become a figure in the truth movement. Our government is patently and blatantly lying to us. That is not the American way. We have to reform that. We have to demand of all future presidents the truth at the risk of impeachment, because it's wrong to keep the truth back from the American people. As Robert Kennedy said in 1968, in the last speech that he gave, we are a great people, and then he said more significantly, we are a generous people, a selfless people. When I calculated the fact that, when I learned that 1 million Americans from Bunker Hill to Baghdad have died in American wars, most of them fought in defense of freedom. And in the calculation, I calculated that if we could sort of magically lay every American combat fatality on the ground and place their bodies shoulder to shoulder in the same place and time, they would stretch 600 miles. 600 miles of Americans laid shoulder to shoulder on the ground, not foot to head, have died in service to our country. That's the distance from Los Angeles in the south to San Francisco in the north. Today, when you go home, try to go online and find 2 other cities in the world that are 600 miles apart. If you've ever driven from LA to San Francisco or San Francisco to LA, imagine your friend is driving, you're in the passenger seat looking out the window, and you look out the window from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And as you look out the window, you see 1 million American combat fatalities positioned shoulder to shoulder on the ground. Okay. Now, when we think about that, I have to submit to any audience, and I do this with every audience. In light of that sacrifice, the sacrifice of our fathers, our grandfathers, I mean, my grandfather's brother was killed at Verdun during World War II. My father and 10 of his siblings were in uniform during World War II, and several of them, including my father, saw combat. In light of this great sacrifice, this military sacrifice of our veterans that we honor every year on Memorial Day and on Veterans Day. We just celebrated Veterans Day on the 11th. Is it really any longer tenable that our government now should be lying to us, the American people? I mean, the people who crossed the Atlantic, who settled the prairie, who fought the Civil War to save the Union and make slaves free people, who liberated Europe from Nazi enslavement and Asia from the Japanese Imperial Army. You know, we are a great people. We are the people who were the first to land on the moon and Mars. We are the first to have cured dread diseases by doing things like developing antibiotics. My left leg was just saved from an infection by 2 very powerful antibiotics. When I went into my physician, he said, "Partner," this is in North Carolina where the physicians tell you everything because of their malpractice laws. He said, "I'm sure glad you came into my office today, because if you had come into my office tomorrow with this infection, I was going to have to tell you about how I was going to have to take your leg off below the knee." Okay? So we have done great things, even just in medicine, as a people. The development of penicillin, the development of heart surgery, brain surgery, artificial limbs that are now robotic, not just pegs of wood like they were after the Civil War. I mean, after the Civil War, the leading industry, the leading business in cities and towns alike, that is major cities and small towns alike, were artificial arms and legs for men who had lost their limbs during the Civil War. Okay, so when I look at this great service of our country, not just the soldiers, but the everyday Americans just going about their lives, we deserve to be told the truth by our own government. And even when he leaves office, I will continue to make these points about President Obama because he failed the test of presidential leadership in this way. I do think he's been treated harshly in terms of his overall leadership, but he sure did fail the truth principle when he constructed these disinformation ploys and insulted me the way that he did. And here he's denying that he knows that Mars is inhabited. That's just plain lying, because he knows otherwise. Okay, enough said. Recently, President Obama published an editorial on CNN.com that was accompanied on the link on Facebook to this misty photograph of Barack Obama looking up into the stars. I consider this the height of deception and cynicism. Here's somebody who rightfully could stand on his accomplishments as a former American astronaut, who they're portraying as a philosophical president in a simple shirt, looking up at the heavens like Walt Whitman, contemplating when we're going to reach Mars, when he himself reached it in 1981. Okay, here's what he said on CNN.com, 10/11/16. I wonder, could 10/11 have been selected as the publication date because he had knocked down, we had revealed about him on 10/11? I don't know. It's a curious synchronicity, though. Anyway, he basically wrote an editorial that stated that America will take the next great leap to Mars in the 2030s, the next great leap being landing humans there. Can you think of any higher folly or any higher deception than a former American astronaut serving as president, denying his own service, and in a single life perpetrating a 50-year cover-up of American visitation of the red planet? I mean, he was one of the jumpers. Now as president, he's saying we're going to reach Mars in the 2030s. I'm sorry, that is just the most blatant lie. Sometimes I wonder whether there's a personality defect in the people who reach the leadership positions in our society, where they have some kind of personality disorder involving enjoying lying. Because look at the lies look at how Hillary Clinton developed a reputation for being a pathological liar by the second time that she sought the presidency in 2016. And look at how Mr. Trump was doing audaciously dishonest things and then lying that he had done so. Okay, so we have to be governed by the truth principle as a civilization, or we're going to lose our power as a civilization. We might actually fall from our existence as a country upon invasion by foreign powers, as some biblical eschatologists have predicted, that America is actually Babylon in the book of Revelations. I don't believe that has to happen or is going to happen, but I do believe that we better start telling the truth to each other and demanding the truth of our governmental leaders. Because if we don't tell the truth, then we're going to be doing things that are, violent fascist things to other countries, for example, that are going to give them just cause to invade us and topple us from power, topple us from our own control over our destiny as a free people. So I'm very disturbed by this pattern of disinformation coming from the White House. We're not even at war. Why the disinformation? Okay, so why the disinformation? Well, I'm in the second to last section then. Because we're still being governed by one old extraterrestrial policy. It was written by this man, physicist, I forget his first name, I think it was William Durant. Dr. Durant wrote the Durant Report to the CIA's Robertson panel of 1953, in which he advised that we should deny the existence of extraterrestrial life, we should debunk reports of encounters with extraterrestrial life, and we should subject those making reports of ET life to public smear campaigns involving fear and ridicule. Well, that's what I was subjected to by the Colbert Report, when they tried to frame me as being even though I'm an avowed heterosexual, they tried to mock me as the gay lover of Barack Obama on Mars. Ha-ha. Pretty homophobic at that, I might add. And then recently, Chris Hardwick on Comedy Central, same network, in a show called After Midnight, mocked the firefight that Bernard Mendez and I had with the pterodactyls on Mars. Generally, in previous generations, men didn't mock other men's heroism. They were man enough to laud it, to at least appreciate it, at least respect it. But here we have the millennials mocking two men, one in his 50s, one in his 60s, who as young men, in my case, probably not even out of my teens, I was probably 19 or 20, 21. Well, actually, when the firefight occurred, I don't know what period that was, but I was no older than 22 years of age. And so White Crow was, being 8 years old, was about 30. And we were fighting like hell to save our lives and Brett's life against vicious predators. When does a shark attack, or a grizzly bear attack, or a mountain lion attack on Earth give rise to humor? Well, somehow, Chris Hardwick thought it was hilarious because our fight for our life was on another planet. So again, this is the legacy, the negative legacy of the Durant report of the CIA's Robertson panel of 1952-53. Okay, so realizing that this was the state of our culture as a free people, that our civilization has become endangered by political leaders who lie and entertainers who mock valorous behavior, I decided to launch my presidential campaign in 2016. I will continue to run for president. I will be seeking the Democratic nomination for president in 2020. I will be governed by the truth principle. Specifically, I will admit the existence of ET life. I will publish reports of extraterrestrial life, even on the White House website, the presidential website. And I will support the proposition that the people of the United States, and for that matter of the world, have a human right to know about the cosmos that we inhabit, including that it is an inhabited cosmos, and that we live in an inhabited solar system, inhabited not just by Earthlings, but Martians. And so I included revealing the ET presence on Earth in my 100 proposals, my new agenda for a new America in 2016. I also will launch a discrete Mars policy as president. I will admit the history of the US presence on Mars. I will declassify the CIA's Mars files, and I will sponsor the promulgation of an international treaty to protect Mars ecology and civilization from visitation, exploration, habitation, and colonization by human beings from Earth. And I included that in my 100 proposals, where I have disclosing the secret US presence on Mars and then calling for the Mars Protection Treaty. Because at the end of the day, we have to remember, as we make our first steps, our baby steps out into the wider cosmos, that the things we will find there do not belong to us just because we discover them for ourselves. They belong to the humanoids and animals that already inhabit those realms. And I'll just close by saying that's what's motivated me to come forward ultimately as a Mars whistleblower. It's not just to toot my own horn, but to herald the fact that Mars doesn't belong to us, it belongs to the Martians. So thank you for coming, and I'd like to open the floor up to questions, and I'll try to give you the best possible answer that I can. Thank you.